The world in which humans live is very vast, and at the very center of the world is a snowy wasteland teeming with monsters. In this center of this world lives a white snake that devours entire glaciers, a white bear capable of causing earthquakes and destroying all structures around it, a vile rat that pollutes the seawater and tears everything in its path with its poisonous teeth. However, the emperor, who barely survived in this cruel land, previously said that the most dangerous thing in the center of the world is not monsters at all. The snowy wasteland is famous for its long winters, but the people who live in this place are highly skilled in martial arts. They see no obstacles before them, and in moments of danger they destroy everything in their path. At this time of year, a group of winter people were attacked by strange creatures, which they had to destroy. There were 3 people in the troop, and one of them was a huge guy who always destroyed everything. After tearing the monster apart, the ally did not understand whether it was necessary for him to behave like a stupid barbarian, and he does not understand how much longer he will have to hang out with these fools. A girl from the group approached him and decided to find out if blockheads were something edible. The guy saw that she didn't understand anything and told her to forget it. After the battle, the girl and the dimwit began to eat these creatures. The guy got angry when he saw this, because he had told them not to eat this filth. After all, they could get poisoned and die. In less than a second, they had already eaten everything. The girl tried to explain it to him, but he didn't understand. She decided to praise him, saying that he was so smart that even they were impressed. The guy didn't understand her and wondered if it was a compliment. Suddenly, Dumbass began to feel strange. Clutching his throat, PETA began to fly out of his mouth. The girl was scared for him and started calling him Greta. Immediately after that, Dumbass collapsed to the ground. She begged Greta to wake up and didn't understand what had happened to him. The guy watched all this, but he didn't care about him. Meanwhile, the girl yelled at Greta and asked him to wake up. The guy stepped aside and didn't understand that this was not what he wanted at all. In fact, he wanted to enter a world of fantasy, magic, and dreams. In his past life, he quit his job to travel the world. He even conquered the highest mountain on Earth. He reached the equator. He got as far south as possible. But of course, nothing changed. Reality is as far from fantasy as the sky is from the earth. So every night he prayed. He asked that one day he would wake up in a real fantasy world, and his prayer was soon answered. Meanwhile, a group of officials was traveling to another city, and on the way they got caught in a storm. One of the workers was so cold that he began to shiver while sitting in the carriage. The man told him that he needed to wrap up warm so as not to freeze to death. The young man replied that he was doing just that. But the second warrior also turned to the boss and said that no matter how much they were paid for it, he still thought it was a lost cause. After all, crossing the snowy wasteland was a very serious matter. They weren't completely stupid, but the boss got angry and told the warrior to shut up. After all, they had all signed up for it. The boy agreed, but he didn't think it would be so bad. Inside the carriage were some important people. The aristocrat was sitting in the warmth and decided to ask the lady if she was okay. The lady was Melenna from the house of Akasha. She let the aristocrat know that she was fine. But the warrior, hearing her answer, informed her that they were dying of cold. The aristocrat immediately looked at the warrior and called him rude. Melenna asked him not to judge them harshly. They were the only ones who agreed to guide them through the snowy wasteland. She thought about letting them warm up inside. They really did seem to be freezing. The warriors walked slowly and tried to shelter from the snowstorm, but their faces froze faster than they could have imagined. The aristocrat replied to the lady that this could not be done. After all, she did not know what was out there in the wasteland. But Melenna understood that monsters surrounded them in this world. She had heard that a long time ago, an emperor who wanted to rule the whole world had decided to conquer the snowy wasteland. So he gathered an army of the best warriors and soldiers and personally set out to conquer it. Years passed, and the army did not return. The empire, left without an emperor, fell into decline. But one day, the emperor returned. Having lost all his warriors and soldiers, he returned alone, barely alive. He looked decades older and spoke like a man who had lost his mind. He said that there were monsters on the white, snowy field. But the most dangerous thing was not them, it was the barbarians. The barbarians lived in the hellish land from which no one had ever returned alive. The aristocrat made it clear to the lady that this was most likely just a legend. But Melenna believed that it was difficult not to believe the emperor's words. Most of the monsters he described were real and well known. The aristocrat replied that no one had ever claimed to have seen a barbarian before. Melenna was upset and realized that the man was right. No matter how many stories there were about adventures in the snowy wasteland, there was not a word about barbarians in them. Suddenly, the boss stopped the whole group and informed them that there was something ahead. The warrior became curious about what it could be. The boss widened his eyes but couldn't make it out. Meanwhile, a human figure was approaching them. He immediately told the others that he had good news and bad news. The warrior got angry and asked him to tell them. The boss replied that the good news was that it was small. The bad news was that it was coming straight at them. Everyone immediately became alert because they did not understand what it was. They sat on pins and needles, waiting for a miracle. The boss immediately grabbed his sword, but when he saw a clear picture, he assumed it was a person. But the man's appearance was terrifying and immediately instilled fear. Coming closer, they assumed it was a barbarian. The stranger approached them and explained that he could no longer stand this band of barbarians. So he went out for a walk, and he stumbled upon strangers in the wasteland. The stranger was delighted to see them and considered it a miracle. He was an ash barbarian named Ketal. Ketal was friendly and said he was happy to meet them. But when he saw the carts, he realized they were merchants. The boss immediately confirmed his words. Ketal still recognized everyone and asked about the guys who were guarding the merchant. The boss answered him in turn. But Ketal explained that he would advise them to return to where they came from, but he doubted that they would follow his advice. Ketal looked around them and decided that the customer was in the largest carriage. He switched to joking and told them he was sorry they hadn't hired him too. But the boss didn't understand and wanted an explanation. But Ketal immediately realized that they didn't understand a word he was saying. He explained to them that he would be their guide through the snowy wasteland. But boss was puzzled and did not know why the legendary barbarian was offering them help. What was he up to? He decided that perhaps the barbarian wanted to tell them that he did not consider them enemies. But Ketal replied that if he wanted to kill them, they would all be dead by now. Everyone immediately became alert at such loud words, and even the boss froze in place. The aristocrat decided to ask the lady if she had heard this. Melenna replied that she had heard everything. She asked him what was going on. The boss explained to the lady that the barbarian wanted them to hire him as a guide. The lady became curious about what they would do. If they fought him, what did the boss think would happen? The boss replied that he personally did not recommend doing so. The lady asked the boss to inform the barbarian that they agreed. The boss approached the barbarian and told him that permission had been granted. Ketal was delighted and replied that this was good news. Ketal explained to the elder that there was no need to be afraid. They were just mercenaries. And to discuss the matter, he needed to meet with their employer in person. The boss immediately became wary and warned him that if he had any bad intentions, Ketal would interrupt him and reply that he would be careful. The warrior immediately decided to ask the boss if he was sure he could let him talk to the client. The guy replied that the boss had already agreed. After all, they were mercenaries and their job was to stop him somehow. Hearing these words, the boss realized that the barbarian could not be stopped. He asked them not to deceive themselves. Suddenly, Ketal knocked on the door. The aristocrat immediately became frightened and asked the lady not to do that. Melenna asked him to calm down. The barbarian turned out to be a decent person and asked permission to enter. The aristocrat could not find a place for himself in the carriage. Melenna gave the barbarian permission to enter. Ketal sat down in this carriage and, seeing how the man was trembling, asked them to calm down a little. After all, he didn't really wish anyone harm. At that moment, the aristocrat pressed himself against the wall of the carriage and thought that the barbarian was simply lying. Melenna was also in shock and couldn't believe that the legendary barbarian was standing before them, alive and real. She greeted the barbarian and showed that she was pleased to meet him. Ketal shared that it was quite warm in the carriage. In the snowy wasteland, even indoors, it was not easy to keep so much heat. Melenna explained that this was done with magic. The barbarian was right in thinking that magic played a role in the warmth. But he saw that she understood that this place was dangerous. With only mercenaries, their chances of getting out of here alive were slim, and so he would undertake to protect her. But first, he had one condition. Melenna was surprised and decided to find out what he wanted. Ketal replied that he needed knowledge about the outside world. He asked them to tell him everything they knew. That was the condition he wanted to make. Melenna asked again if the barbarian wanted to know what the world was like beyond the snowy wasteland. The barbarian replied that this was correct, and he thought that the lady would lose nothing. The lady understood that they had no choice but to agree. She explained to him that she understood everything. Catal realized that she had agreed and decided to ask her name. Melenna introduced herself and told him where she was from. Catal also introduced himself to her and showed that he was happy to cooperate with her. Kettle had always dreamed of living in a fantasy world, and one day he woke up in the body of a barbarian of the snowy wastelands. He didn't have time to understand what had happened. He was surrounded by a deadly climate and monsters of unimaginable power. In order to survive, he led the tribes of the snowy wasteland barbarians, hunting and conquering. But he doesn't really understand how much time has passed. Without counting the months and years, he continued to fight, doing everything he could to get out of these terrible snowfields. But the system always showed him that the task was not completed, and he could leave the snowfield after completing the task. He decided that some unknown force was preventing him from leaving the snowy fields. And when he was almost in despair, still not understanding why anyone would voluntarily go to such a place, he sometimes began to meet people from the outside world. And then he realized that the world beyond these cursed snowfields was the land of fantasy and magic he had always dreamed of. From that moment on, he knew what he had to do. Survival was not enough. He had to take action. He began to complete one task after another, defeating monsters and getting closer with each victory to escaping this cursed wasteland. The system always showed him how many tasks he had completed and notified him that the next task would be issued shortly. He was always spurred on by the thought that one day he would get out anyway. And he decided that since there was no way out, information from people from the outside world who occasionally passed through the wasteland was incredibly valuable. But most of the people he met either grabbed their weapons or went crazy. And finally, he met someone he could talk to. He couldn't remember the last time he had spoken to someone sane. After all, after communicating with uncouth barbarians, talking to a civilized person was like balm for his soul. Catal realized that they were transporting weapons, but decided to ask the lady herself. Melenna replied that it was true, but she didn't understand how he had figured it out. The barbarian said that he could hear the sharp clang of steel coming from the carts. It was hard not to notice, to be honest. But is there really a war going on in the outside world? He asked. The lady replied that it was true, and now the empire and the kingdom were at war. The main character understood everything, which meant that the outside world was not particularly peaceful either. Melenna explained that, unfortunately, the mighty empire had gathered enormous power, but the kingdom was defending itself and would not give up its lands, because a swordsman and a hero had been sent to the border. Catal was surprised and decided to find out what powers these people possessed. Melenna saw that he knew nothing about mysticism. Catal explained that he had never actually left this place, but the lady replied that she herself did not really understand it either, but that there was a power in this world called mysticism. Only a few can feel or use it, and they are divided into 5 levels of milli. The lowest is the 3rd class, which consists of those who can only sense mysticism. The next level is the 2nd class, and starting from the 2nd class, a person already possesses mystical power. Then there is the 1st class, those in whom mystical power manifests itself in the form of mana or aura. Usually, knights, mages, and spirit summoners are considered 1st class. Above this is the transcendent level, where ranks lose their meaning. This is called the transcendent level. Such people freely control mysticism and can cut through the sky and the earth. The swordsman belongs to this rank. And then there are heroes. These are beings who not only possess mysticism, but whose power is capable of shaking the world. A hero is a living legend. And frankly speaking, the fact that their power can be measured by ranks is proof of their superpowers. Even the 3rd class makes him a significant force in a small region. Catal immediately said that he would like to meet one of them. Melenna was shocked by his words and froze in place. But Catal didn't even remember how long he had been suffering here. He was just desperately trying to survive. And all he knows is that these snowy fields lie at the heart of a fantastic world, and it is impossible to get out of here. Between the outside world and the fantasy world, he wanted to leave these snowy fields, but in reality he must do it for his future. The lady decided to ask Catal if he was really a barbarian. The barbarian replied that it was true, and judging by her reaction, she knew who he was. Melenna told him that there were legends. The barbarian was surprised that there were legends about him. Seeing his expression, the lady realized that the barbarian did not even know about this. After listening to the story, Catal understood how everything had turned out. He didn't even know then that the old man was an emperor. He thought the old man was just crazy, but that didn't matter anymore. And the lady's legend was probably true. Long ago, people like them had come here, and judging by these carts, they were transporting a lot of weapons. There was a special reason why they needed to pass through the snowy wasteland. The lady understood his words and replied that they were in dire need of money. Katalu became curious as to why. Melenna explained that their family had always been in trade. They had made a fortune, but jealous competitors had set them up, and now they were up to their ears in debt. This trading trip was their last chance to save their family from ruin. And now Catal assumes that in order to pay off their debts, they are going to sell weapons to the kingdom that is at war with the empire. The lady was surprised because the barbarian spoke the truth, and everything was so true, as if he had been there. But Catal explained that she had previously said that the empire had numerical superiority. That meant there were enough weapons there. And that meant that the kingdom needed weapons, not the empire. Shortages drive up prices where demand is high and supply is low. Of course, he doesn't know the prices outside, but such a cargo must be worth a fortune. Risking one's life to cross the snowy fields may be justified. And since the lady has decided to make her way through the snowy wastelands, it must be the only way to the kingdom. And she wants to know if her land borders the empire? Melenna replied that everything was correct. But in her mind, she thought it was impossible. After all, barbarians are usually uncouth and uneducated people. She asked him directly who he was. Was he really a barbarian? Suddenly, the carriage stopped. The aristocrat immediately became alert and heard strange cries from the street. Catal looked closely and said that they had an uninvited guest. The boss stepped forward and saw a huge monster climbing out of a snowdrift, ready to destroy everything in its path. The boss started shouting that it was black slime. Catal heard the name of the monster and didn't even know what it was called before. The lady said that it was true. It was the monster described in the records. Catal asked, "In what other records?" Melenna replied that over the years, many strong people had challenged the white snowy wasteland, but only a few had managed to survive to tell the tale. And those who survived recorded what monsters they encountered, and black slime is mentioned most often. The lady became curious to know if Ketil knew about it. The barbarian replied that he did. They are actually quite a tasty snack, quite a delicacy. Melenna froze, unable to believe that they ate them. Ketal offered her some and promised to catch one for her. The lady did not want to eat them, but she thanked him for the opportunity. Suddenly, slime approached the cart, and everyone around was frightened. The lady immediately turned to the barbarian. Catal sighed and realized that he had made a contract with them. He said he would protect their lives, and they would not interfere until it became truly dangerous. The lady was curious to know what he meant. Catal replied that these guys could handle it themselves. Besides, he was interested in assessing their level himself. The slime began to attack the warriors, and with its strange voice, it began to growl. The boss immediately ordered them to use their shields. The slime hit the warriors with such force that one of them couldn't stay on his feet and flew into a snowdrift. The next warrior immediately seized the moment and attacked the monster with his axe from above. But the monster managed to react and attacked the warrior in response, not even letting him get close. The slime slowly approached the main carriage, but the boss stood still and waited for the right moment to attack. The boss understood that black slimes could only move in a straight line. He ordered his warriors to spread out and act in unison. The warriors grabbed their weapons and understood the order. They all decided to attack the monster at once. After the first strike, the monster did not have time to react and was wounded, immediately screaming out in pain. Immediately after that, the next attack followed. The warrior used his spear and threw it at the monster with great force. The spear was so sharp that it pierced through the monster, leaving huge holes in its body. The boss asked them not to give up and to keep attacking. The boss himself chose the perfect moment and decided to strike with his sword. He realized that simple strikes would not help. He ordered them to aim directly at the core. The boss began to act differently and attacked the monster from the sky so that it would not notice the coordination of the strike. Hitting the target directly, the boss cut the monster's core in two with his sword. After the core was destroyed, the monster immediately dissolved like a molecule, The warrior rejoiced and began shouting that they had done it, and everyone immediately celebrated. The lady inside the carriage also heard that they had succeeded, but suddenly everything changed in an instant, and the warriors shouted that another monster had appeared. The boss immediately ordered his warriors to strike at its neck. The warriors tried to hit the target, but its skin and body were very strong. The warrior covered himself with liquid and began to say that the white snowy wasteland was nothing special. He took everything upon himself and destroyed the monster. And he decided to find out if all these rumors were exaggerated. The boss asked him not to let their guard down. They weren't even halfway there yet. The warrior became curious. Was the barbarian really that strong? Were all these monsters and other things just tales from the emperor's legends? They say he is at the bottom of the food chain in the white snowy wasteland. I wonder if he's just taking advantage of them. But at the very least, shouldn't they test his abilities? The lady and the barbarian immediately thought about it and looked at each other silently. One of the warriors approached the lady and asked to speak with her, but the lady became curious about what they meant by test. The warrior replied that they were risking their lives by carrying out this task. That was only natural. They were mercenaries, hired to serve her. The lady informed them that she was grateful that they had agreed to take on this task, that they had accepted his request. The lady understood that their task was to protect her on her way across the snowy field. Everyone else had fled as soon as they found out what they were going to do. Without them, she would never have dared to do it. But the warrior said that there was something that really worried her. That barbarian had never fought before, and he wanted to make sure he had real combat skills. He had a bad feeling about it. And then the lady understood what kind of test the warrior was talking about. The boss explained to her that he had tried to hush it up, but they wouldn't listen to him. Catal heard everything and shouted loudly that the mercenaries had decided to test his skills, and he was not opposed to their proposal. But he was afraid that it was impossible now. First, they had a guest. The soldiers did not understand what he was talking about. They considered his words nonsense. But suddenly, a voice was heard saying that some pathetic mortals had reached this land, and finally, there would be a decent meal for a change. The warriors felt fear in their bodies and immediately prepared to attack. Turning around, they saw a huge monster behind them that looked like a dragon. It asked the mortals to bark for it, and they had better scream and writhe as much as they wanted. After all, it would only improve the taste of dinner. The snake used its sound waves, which were so loud that even the warriors covered their ears and couldn't stand it. Catal immediately ordered the monster to stop and informed it that they were guests, and that the snake should leave. The snake asked him why he was here. Had the barbarian forgotten his rules? If he left his tribe's territory? The barbarian interrupted him and made it clear that it was none of his business. But the snake asked him not to be ridiculous. And before him stood a barbarian nicknamed Snake. And some barbarian dared to give orders to him, the one who had been promised eternity. Catal was not afraid and realized that the barbarian snake was simply asking for a beating. Seizing the perfect moment, Catal gathered all his strength into one fist and struck Snake squarely in the body. The blow was so strong that the snake flew into the air and opened its mouth in pain. It was so powerful that the energy turned into a huge shell. All the warriors tried to stay on their feet. Catal explained that some only start listening after a good beating. The snake was immobilized and collapsed to the ground. The lady was worried about him and turned to him. Catal explained that he would go and deal with the rest, and it wouldn't take long. Using his power, Catal began to move at tremendous speed. With powerful blows, he killed everyone in his path. After the job was done, the warriors approached the barbarian and said that they had committed a terrible sin. They asked him for mercy. Catal replied that it was not a sin and explained that it was natural not to trust strangers so quickly. He understood. Setting off again, this time the aristocrat was on the street and moved along with the other warriors. Suddenly, the barbarian remembered and said that since the lady had mentioned it, he was even curious. Judging by her clothes and manner of speaking, he doubted that she was just a family agent. But why risk her life and personally accompany this trade caravan? Melenna replied that she was the first daughter of the concubine Beliak from the Akasha clan. Upon hearing this, Catal asked if that meant she was the second wife. Melenna replied that this was correct. She had married for political reasons but had been used and rejected. Her poor mother never had any real power. Catal replied that he understood. He and his mother were formerly a family, but in reality they were nothing. They were treated like servants. Melenna didn't really want to say so much. She explained that she herself had volunteered to participate in this trade expedition. Catal didn't believe her and asked her again if it was true. The lady replied that it was. Even when it comes to life and death, someone has to set an example. Catal saw this and said that she was quite clever, and she had great ambitions. One might even say greedy. But suddenly someone shouted from the street that they had arrived. The warriors and the boss were shocked and stared at everything with wide eyes. Upon arriving in the steppe, the lady thanked the barbarian for his help, but Catal asked her what she would do on the way back. Melenna replied that she had returned through the empire. The barbarian understood that when she sold the weapons, she would be left empty-handed, and then it would be easy to cross the border. The lady was surprised and said that the barbarian had said she was smart and ambitious. But what did he mean? Catal explained that he meant exactly what he said. She was smart and ambitious. Her family was once famous, but now it was unstable and lacked resources. And even as the daughter of a concubine, if she shows initiative and finds a way forward, while the clan is on the brink. But it became interesting to see who she thought the others would trust and follow. After all, her goal was to gain real power in the family, wasn't it? Catal saw her gaze and thought he was wrong. But in fact, the lady understood that this was absolutely true. The lady replied that he was right, and that she would risk everything, being the child of a concubine, for the sake of the family's future. Such a story could happen in any era. This barbarian is perceptive, not like those dimwits who only pretend to be smart, and such power to defeat the white snake almost without a scratch. If only she could get such power on her side. The lady turned to him and said that if he ever decided to leave the wasteland, would he like to join her? Catal replied that for now he had to decline. He still had unfinished business. Melenna understood everything and thought that in that case she would offer him this necklace. And if he ever made it out and was looking for Akasha's house, he should show this token. Catal replied that if it was a gift, he would gladly accept it. The aristocrat also turned out to be a good man and thanked the barbarian for his help. She wished that they would meet again someday. After saying goodbye to them, Catal remained on the snowy side. 5 years later, in the white snowy wasteland, he finally fulfilled all the conditions. The system said that the quests were complete, and he received his reward. And now he could leave the snowy wasteland. Catal approached the barrier and saw that he was about to take his first step into the fantastic world he had always dreamed of. Crossing to the other side, he began to smell fresh grass and animals. None of this could be found in the snowy wasteland. It was simply wonderful, truly wonderful. Looking back at the snowy wasteland, he hoped he would never see it again. In fact, this was the fantastic world he had dreamed of, a place he never thought he would find himself in, a world of wonders and the unknown. He started with the most terrible thing, but survived. And so, he decided that he would enjoy this world. Magic and fencing, dragons and elves, everything fantasy has to offer. And if it weren't for that desire, he would have died long ago. The snowy wasteland was hell. The will to live alone was not enough to survive. He listened carefully and sensed that there were many people ahead. He assumed there were trees there. Could it be that he would finally see a real settlement in this world? He had told these foolish barbarians so many times that they needed proper shelter, but they just dug holes in the snow and slept in them. And in response, they just blinked, not understanding anything. He missed a well-built, organized human village so much, but he didn't know what to say to them when he met them. Maybe he would just say hello, or ask, according to tradition, what kind of world this was. But whatever he did, he would be polite. Approaching the place, he saw huge trees that were so magnificent that he was amazed. But besides that, the chief elf addressed the residents and said that from now on, this would be their new home. And he asked them to start unpacking. The elves were delighted to hear these words. Suddenly, one elf approached the elder. The chief asked if something was wrong. The elf asked him if he was sure that this place was really safe. The elder replied that it was safe. It was a remote, wild area. People couldn't get here. But the elf understood that the snowy wasteland was not exactly nearby. The elder saw that the resident was worried that monsters could come out of there. The elf replied that it was indeed close, too close. The elder promised that there was nothing to worry about. Nothing had ever come out of there in thousands of years. Besides, he had put up a barrier just in case. He knew that the barrier hid their presence and made the place look like an ordinary forest, and as long as the barrier held, no outsiders could get close. They had barely managed to restore it. And as long as the barrier held, no outsiders could get close. And even if monsters appeared, everything would be fine. After all, the queen was with them. Even monsters wouldn't be able to get to her. Suddenly, Catal felt something burst. And he probably broke something. He moved forward and didn't know how far he still had to go. Suddenly, he saw a little girl with pointed ears under his feet. He immediately realized that she was a real elf. One of the first races that come to mind when you hear the word fantasy. He didn't expect to meet one so early either, and considers it good luck. And he is glad that he survived after all this. Meanwhile, the elf was very scared and didn't know where she was. She had probably gone too far. But suddenly she saw a shadow next to her and looking up, was shocked by what she saw. Meanwhile, Catal greeted her. The elf girl immediately froze in place and fainted. Catal managed to react and caught her. Catal saw that he had barely managed to say something when she suddenly lost consciousness. He decided to carry her to the village, but he remembered that in most myths, elves are a peaceful, orderly race, and if he returned the unconscious girl, perhaps they would take him for a good person. And he was even curious about elven hospitality, and to be honest, he was a little excited. But still, Catal did not abandon her and carried her in his arms. The elves suddenly started shouting that a stranger had arrived and that he looked like a human. They were all frightened and didn't know what to do. The elf immediately stood guard and asked the stranger who he was and how he had passed through the barrier. Catal realized that things had not gone as he had hoped. The elf mother screamed in grief for her daughter. The elder also understood that this could not be. This place should be inaccessible to humans, and he did not know why there was a human here. He said that the barrier should have worked. The elf immediately shouted to the elder that there was a crack in the barrier. The elder did not believe it and asked where the queen was. The elf replied that Her Majesty was now inspecting the surroundings. Catal immediately informed them that he was not their enemy, but the elf mother began to threaten him and said that if he did not return the child, she would pursue him to the ends of the earth. The elder immediately realized that they had been exposed. The barrier had been created using ancient elven techniques and could not be overcome by ordinary means. If it had been destroyed, it meant that the humans had prepared in advance, and now he didn't know how long they had been following them. Catal thought that they had mistaken him for the kidnapper. He needed to explain to them urgently that this was a misunderstanding. Just then, Elphick woke up with tears in her eyes. But Catal was kind, and letting her go on the ground, told her to return to her people. Elphick was shocked by this, but when she looked into his eyes again, she became very frightened and began to cry and scream. Catal thought that his face was really that scary, and it seemed to him that he looked quite normal. In any case, he returned the child. Catal explained to them that he was not an enemy, but the elder didn't care. He shouted that the hostage had been freed, and let them fight him. They drew their arrows and immediately fired the entire quiver at him. Catal realized that no one could hear what he was saying. He realized that the elves were much wilder than he had imagined. The elves of legend were supposed to be a peaceful people, loving nature and striving for peace. But these elves were cruel and savage. On the other hand, they were a race living in the wild. And nature is a world where only the strongest survive. And now he understands that ferocity is quite natural, and that's how it really is. The elves saw that nothing was working and decided that the man had some kind of artifact. But there must be limits, and it is worth continuing to attack. Catal bent his arms in front of his body and said that everyone could relax, then used his repulsion power. The elves were very frightened and began to shout for them to turn the barrier around. The force was so strong and powerful that everything around them was simply blown out of place and could not be held back. The elder did not understand what this was. Catal explained to them that he was not their enemy. He thought that perhaps he had gone a little too far. But then he felt a fiery arrow coming towards him. The arrow hit its target and exploded, surprising everyone. The elder was also shocked, for he saw Her Majesty. She was the heroine of Apaya, the queen of the Leaf clan. Her name was Marcelia Hassiane Caruzia. Marcelia asked what was going on. The elder shouted that a man had attacked them. Marcelia thought about it and shared that this place was unsafe. But Catal explained that he would be grateful if they would listen to him. Everyone was shocked. and the elder also said that this could not be. The enemy remained unharmed even after a direct blow from Her Majesty. Marcelia realized that even someone as strong as him was hunting them, and now she sees that people are truly disgusting. And since she is the queen of the indigo-colored clan, she promises to make him pay for his greed. Catal saw that she did not understand him, but they clearly speak the same language. She simply ignores him. And perhaps relations between humans and elves are so bad, but there's nothing to be done about it. It's one of the rules he learned in the tundra. People start listening when they get hit on the head. Marcelia pulled the bowstring and shot her arrow at him, but the arrow turned out to be completely different. As it flew, it took the form of a vicious dragon. But Catal did not move from his place and, clenching his fist, he launched it into battle and aimed it at the dragon. His blow repelled the queen's attack, and he launched a counterattack at her, destroying the dragon into several pieces. Marcelia was surprised and did not know how this had happened. Catal immediately realized that things were not going well. She was unable to repel the attack and was wounded, flying into the sky and crashing into a wall. He realized that he should have held back even more. Marcelia understood this after one collision. And this guy is very strong, at least above the transcendent level. And why is someone so powerful here? She ordered everyone to leave this place immediately. The elves did not want to say goodbye to the queen and were indignant, but Marcelia shouted at them again to run away from here. She informed the man that she recognized his strength, but he would never achieve his goal here. Catal replied that this was not the case. He just wanted to talk. He had a feeling that everything had gone completely wrong, and she recognized him, the keeper of the essence of pristine purity, and she recognized him, the bearer of black darkness. Marcelia released her fiery essence and directed it toward the sky. She created Piego, a fiery bison. Catal was a little surprised and realized that it was a call, and the creatures in the tundra were ugly and strange. Some even looked like they came from a fairy tale, but most were simply repulsive. And this creature in front of him had horns of blazing fire, and he considers this spirit to be truly fantastic. Marcelia turned to Piego and ordered him to destroy the enemy in front of him. Piego replied that the contracts were not worth it. They only caused problems. But the queen did not like this and ordered him to be quiet. She understood that Piego was a creature embodying pure flame, and the stronger the spirit, the older it is and the greater its pride. She could barely summon him with her power, but she managed to conclude the contract only with the help of another tribe, and she could not imagine that she would summon him in such circumstances. Marcelia turned to Piego and ordered him to fulfill the contract. Piego decided to find out if the contract was simply to kill the man standing in front of him, but Piego looked closely at him and couldn't tell if he was human, but he didn't care because he had to fulfill the contract. Catal considered him a strangely gifted beast. He couldn't believe he was in a fantasy world. The queen explained to the monster that humans had invaded their lands. Piego immediately decided that the pathetic man had dared to encroach on the forces of nature, and he decided to turn him to ashes. Piego turned sharply toward the barbarian and charged at him with his fiery horns. Catal was not afraid and stood his ground. The impact caused a huge explosion, and it was unclear what had happened. The queen closed her eyes from the intense flames, but she was a little surprised that the man had stopped Piego with his bare hands. He smiled and called Piego a beast, showing that he was calm. Clenching his fist tighter, he told the beast that now it would be easier to beat him to death. Catal showed no mercy to the beast and sent his fist flying into its head with a powerful blow. Piego could do nothing against such a blow and swept through the village like a hurricane. The force of the blow was so great that the magic of reflection affected the other inhabitants. The queen fell to her knees and did not understand what was happening. She could not believe that such a thing was possible. Catal approached her and heard her ask him to spare her kin. Catal explained to her that he was not her enemy. The queen did not understand at first, and then looked at him with surprised eyes. After a long conversation, the queen finally understood that he was not their enemy. The queen acknowledged this and apologized to him for her hasty conclusions, and she realized that they had mistaken the savior of their clan's child for an enemy, and for her, this was a terrible insult. Catal replied that it was all right. She said that people had driven them here, so he understood. Still, it was a little sad that she hadn't let him explain himself. The queen asked him again if he was really not one of those people who wanted to conquer them. Catal replied that this was the first time in his life he had seen an elf. There were none in the snowy wasteland. Hearing about the snowy wasteland, the queen froze in surprise. She realized that he was an ash barbarian from the wasteland. Catal explained that this was what foreigners called him. The queen did not believe it and did not think that people could survive there at all. And if he came from the wasteland, did that mean others could escape too, she asked? Catal replied that he did not know, but he doubted that anyone else could. He knew that the wasteland had strict rules. Even powerful creatures like snakes couldn't break them, and for some reason, he had managed to circumvent them in the form of a task. But this was probably a very rare exception. The queen calmed down immediately, but Catal became curious. Was everything okay with her call? That bull, he broke it in half. The queen told him not to worry. Spirits of nature creatures. If the connection with the summoner is forcibly severed, they simply return to the spirit world. And now she had insulted him and did not know how to make amends, and she would do everything she could for him. Katalu immediately became curious. Could creatures other than elves enter into contracts with spirits? The queen replied that this was most likely impossible. And of course, among humans, those who have a strong connection with nature can sometimes make contracts. Katalu immediately realized that this was impossible, but the queen suggested that if he really wanted to make a contract with a spirit, he should go to Elfo Sagrado. Their god lives there, the sacred land of the elves. There it might be possible. But Catal asked if someone like him would be allowed in. The queen explained that usually they are not allowed in. But with her recommendation, anything is possible. And now she would tell him how to get there. But he must keep it a secret. She told him that the sacred land of the elves, Elfo Sagrado, is the dream of every elf explorer. But for the elves, allowing a human to approach this place was incredibly dangerous. They value this place more than their own lives. No elf would ever reveal its location. But still, now she wants to believe him. She created a fire crystal and gave it to the barbarian. Catal took the crystal and replied that he would accept it with gratitude. But the queen warned him that even if he got close, their god might still test him. But she thinks he will succeed and wishes him luck. But she did not forget to introduce herself. And she decided to find out the guy's name too. Catal did not leave her without information and introduced himself in return, and immediately set off on a new path. He moved through the forest at great speed and saw no obstacles ahead of him. But nearby was the border of the Varkan territory, where the kingdom of Gehent was built. The guard sensed something and realized that something was approaching them. He immediately ordered the others to ring the bell and raise the alarm. Catal stopped and slowly emerged from the forest so as not to frighten the people. The guard was shocked to see such a huge man. Catal immediately assumed that they were guards and showed that he was glad to meet them. But the guards did not say anything in response and exchanged glances with each other. They thought and couldn't believe that this guy had caused such a commotion. He had ash-gray hair and a scar on his chest, and they immediately realized that he was an ash barbarian. Catal began to move toward the castle, but the guards drew their swords and ordered him to stay where he was. If he dared to move, they would defend themselves. Catal explained that he wanted them to calm down. He was not their enemy. The guard asked him what he wanted from them. Catal did not answer them and pointed his finger towards the castle. The guards were surprised and turned around, realizing that he wanted to go inside. Catal explained that he wanted to visit their territory. The guards were shocked and couldn't believe it. The guard invited him in anyway and asked him if a barbarian really wanted to visit the territory, and if his goal was to pass through it. Kettle replied that he certainly wanted to, and if possible, he would stay for a while. But he didn't know for how long yet. The guard understood his intentions and decided to find out his name. Catal introduced himself and did not hide anything. But the guard needed a document to confirm his identity. Catal replied that he had nothing of the sort. But then he suddenly remembered how Melenna had thanked him for his help, and if he suddenly got out and visited Akasha's house, he would show them this item. He placed the item on the table and decided to find out if it was enough to confirm his identity. The guard looked at the item and did not understand what it was. Catal explained that it was the coat of arms of the Akasha family. He had received it from someone in that family. The guard immediately understood that the Akasha family was a merchant family from the kingdom of Denion. The barbarian explained that several years ago, their daughter had been passing through the snowy wasteland. He asked the guard if he knew them. The guard replied that it was a house that had recently gained prominence. Their influence had grown rapidly after the head of the house changed a few years ago. Catal inquired further and decided that this could be used to confirm his identity. The guard looked at it and replied that it did not appear to be a forgery. However, it was still difficult to confirm. Ketal asked, "Is it really not from this kingdom?" The guard replied that it was from the kingdom of Gehintra, and that cannot be confirmed. But this time it will do, and the barbarian can pass, but there is one condition. Ketal was surprised and did not understand what condition was being referred to. The guard said that they needed to confirm that he was not a threat to the inhabitants. Ketal immediately realized that this was a group task. The guard explained that 3 more people were trying to enter the territory right now. The condition was to clear the border dungeon together with those whose identities were not yet known. Ketal replied that it was just a task and easier than he had expected. He immediately agreed. But the guard said there was one more condition. After clearing the dungeon, he had to report everything that happened inside. Ketal understood everything and said that those whose status was unclear should keep an eye on each other, and in the process, they would identify the suspicious ones. And that wasn't a bad idea, and it was very clever. The guard replied that this was not quite the case. He asked Ketal if it was true that he was a barbarian. Ketal did not hide anything and replied that he was a barbarian. But in reality, the guard thought they were just savages, and he was the first barbarian he had ever met. But it was time for them to get down to business. Meanwhile, the rest of the people were in confinement, and the self-proclaimed paladin Alessandro Tiranu said that this was beneath his dignity. The thief, Kasan Hark, decided to ask him why he was looking for a fight again. Was he angry because the thief had cheated him and stolen his money? Tyrannus didn't like that, and didn't understand how a petty thief dared to insult a paladin. Hark didn't believe he was a paladin. He decided to find out if paladins dressed like that now. In fact, a paladin would never have come here in the first place. He was just a wandering mercenary, pretending to be someone he wasn't. He was just as much trash as everyone else in that room. And doesn't he realize what an idiotic surname Tyrannus is? The paladin didn't like that and immediately grabbed his sword. Hark sat calmly and asked him if he really wanted to fight. Or did he think that his tattered armor would protect him? Meanwhile, Hark also pulled out his knife, which was covered in poison. They began to fight right in the cell, and sparks flew from their swords when they touched. But then a woman's voice asked them to stop this childish behavior. She couldn't believe she would have to clear the dungeon with them, and she didn't know if she would survive with such partners. The girl was a priestess of Colosia named Hayes. She knew that the minimum number of people needed for a dungeon expedition was 4, so it turned out that someone else had to come. Suddenly, the door opened and the guard said that the last person had arrived. Hark immediately hoped that it would be a normal person. Just then, Ketal entered the room with his huge body. Everyone immediately froze in their tracks. Upon entering, Ketal realized that these were his partners. Tyrannus was surprised, because the guy turned out to be a giant, and Heisi didn't understand if he was a person or a monster. The guard left them all and asked them to talk among themselves. He promised he would be back soon. Ketal introduced himself as a barbarian and showed that he was pleased to meet them. Then he followed suit and began to introduce himself. Stopping at Paladin, he decided to find out if he used holy power. Tyrannus replied that paladins usually use it, but he is quite special and does not know how to do it. Hayes immediately said that she served the god of lies and deceit and was a priestess of Colosia. Ketal was surprised and decided to find out if even priestesses had to prove their identity. Hayes replied that the god she served was the god of lies and deceit. Naturally, he was not particularly respected. A few hours later, the guard approached them and said that if everyone was ready, it was time to leave. Everyone was a little wary, but they had no other choice. An hour later, they arrived at their destination. Ketal looked at the tunnel and froze in surprise. The guard said that this was the entrance to the dungeon, and this dungeon had 3 floors. There were monsters and undead creatures there. They would have to clear the dungeon and return with a trophy as proof. Ketal suggested they start the raid and asked what their plan was. The thief was immediately surprised and addressed him as a high-ranking person. Ketal asked him not to address him as Sir. They were all part of the same team. The thief thought about it and suggested that Ketal and the warrior take the lead. He would check for traps. His sister would support them from the rear with her abilities. Ketal agreed with his plan and suggested they proceed. Once inside, the priestess began to feel frightened because of the darkness, as she could not see anything. The thief saw that there weren't even any ordinary traps or tricks, and it looked suspiciously normal. But suddenly he noticed something and asked Catal to stop, because there were monsters ahead. The barbarian was surprised and replied that he couldn't see anything. The thief decided to show him and told him to look at the scattered bones on the floor. They were skeletons, and if they got closer, they would get up and attack them. And now he understood that he was right. The captain of the guard had known this from the very beginning. And this dungeon, it wasn't just to check their identities. From the very beginning, it was just a way to get rid of unnecessary strangers. Catal didn't even understand this before. But the thief explained that skeletons are strong monsters. They continue to move even if their limbs are cut off. And since they are made of bones, they are stronger than ordinary corpses. They are much more difficult to deal with than he thought. Vor immediately asked his sister to prepare their powers. The warrior had to raise his shield, and Catal also had to get ready. The thief promised them that he would try to find a moment to attack during the battle. After all, a skeleton's body moves even when it is damaged, so it is worth hitting them in the neck, which is their weak spot. In addition, they are quite strong, so you have to hit them several times. Catal listened to the order and understood everything. Catal took a step forward and saw that the skeleton immediately raised its head. Then it slowly began to rise, holding a sword in its hands. It was as if someone was controlling it. The priestess did not stand still and began to use her spell. The thief and Catal immediately prepared for battle, and the skeleton immediately attacked them. But Catal did not use much force and simply destroyed it with one blow of his hand. Everyone was shocked by what they saw and couldn't believe their eyes. Catal rejoiced and said that everything had turned out as the thief had said. The skeleton stops moving if you cut off its head. The thief began to laugh with joy and realized that this was not what he had meant. Skeletons are creatures made of bones. Skeleton bones are extremely hard. Even for an experienced swordsman, it is almost impossible to break a bone with a single blow without using an aura. In addition, the dungeon feeds the skeleton with mana, making it much stronger. The only way to defeat a skeleton is like cutting down a tree. You have to strike its neck repeatedly to break its vertebrae. It is practically impossible to simply cut through the neck or pierce the skull. The thief knew from the very beginning that Catal was strong, but he did not think he was that strong. And now he doesn't even know if Catal is human. The barbarian didn't stop there and suggested moving on. The priestess lagged behind them a little from the shock and shouted that she was running. But Catal asked her not to rush so much. The priestess and the paladin did not want to die in this dungeon and tried not to fall behind. After a while, Catal stopped and saw skeletons in front of him. The thief immediately warned him, but the priestess was surprised and said fearfully that there were skeletons there, and this time they were coming in a group. Suddenly, Catal asked them if he could ask them for a favor. The guys were surprised and didn't know what he was talking about, but Catal said that he would deal with these skeletons himself. There was something he wanted to check. The guys didn't refuse him and gave him permission to do whatever he wanted. Catal thanked them, and his expression immediately changed. At that moment, the skeleton stood up in front of him. The guys didn't know what Catal was going to do. Catal began to examine the skeleton and consider it an amazing creation, but he was curious about how it was made. The skeleton swung his sword, but Catal did not attack immediately, instead stopping the blade with 2 fingers. He immediately squeezed his fingers and broke the sword in 2. He decided to ask the skeleton what he was going to do with it. But the skeleton was not frightened, and he continued to swing his broken sword. Catal continued to stand still and watch what the skeleton was doing. He caught his arm during a strike, but suddenly Skeleton conspired and offered Barbarian this method of fighting. Suddenly, the parts of the skeleton simply detached and fell to the ground. Catal was a little shocked, but when he saw how it reassembled itself, only now without an arm, he gathered even more courage and used magic to pull his sword toward him. Catal was surprised that the skeleton could change hands, but the skeleton did not stop and began to attack. Then Catal stopped it again and broke its second arm, leaving it without limbs and unable to wield its sword. But the skeleton did not stop there and tried to harm him with its sharp limbs. Catal continued to break its limbs. He discovered that the skeleton could even replace its own parts. Its intelligence was quite high. The guys watched this scene and were shocked by what they saw. They didn't understand how he was dealing with them. The warrior considered him a real barbarian. Meanwhile, Catal began to destroy the skeleton's head. After a powerful blow, the skeleton's head simply fell to the ground. And now Catal realized that if he removed the head, The body would not move. Then he approached the skeleton's head, and raising his huge foot, smashed it into small pieces. Catal apologized to the guys for keeping them waiting. The thief replied that it was no big deal, and there was no need to rush. After the work was done, Catal suggested that they move on. When they reached the end, Vor said that this was the second floor. They saw that the staircase led down. They were not afraid, and went down without fear. But suddenly Vor sighed and suggested they rest a little. Catal thought about it and agreed, deciding that it would be better that way. During the rest, Catal still stood with his eyes closed. The others sat down. But he had a question about this dungeon. He felt a little awkward, but his knowledge on the subject was insufficient. The priestess suddenly became frightened and began to say that the pursuit of knowledge is a virtue. She herself is not very knowledgeable. Catal said he was grateful to her in advance. The priestess decided to ask him what he wanted to know. Catal explained that this dungeon was quite close to the border. Were there any problems for the population with the dungeon and monsters? The priestess replied that monsters from the dungeon usually do not come out. However, there are exceptions. Such cases are identified and resolved in advance. But the thief choked and said that dungeons were a natural phenomenon. Sometimes they appeared in the form of caves, and sometimes in the form of towers. Most dungeons appear near densely populated areas. Now, Catal understood why he had appeared here. But the priestess remembered that when dungeons appear, the local lord assesses the level of danger. And then, to clear it, he sends either outsiders like them or mercenaries or guards. The barbarian asked if they didn't appear inside the territory. The priestess replied that this was correct. They always appear at a certain distance. But suddenly Catal realized that there was a reward for successful completion. The priestess replied that this was correct. Usually, there is a boss on the top floor. Various rewards are given for defeating him. For a dungeon of this size, the rewards must be quite substantial. Catal smiled and realized that it was just like in a game. The priestess heard his words and did not understand what a game was, but Catal explained that he was just thinking out loud. And he had another question. He became curious about who created these dungeons. The priestess was shocked by this question. She told him that the dungeons appear naturally. No one creates them. But there were too many oddities for that to be true. First, they appear near large cities. It's as if they demand to be explored. They appear near settlements, tempting people with treasures. Catal thought that for a natural phenomenon, it seemed too intelligent. The priestess was surprised by his reasoning and agreed with him. And it was so self-evident that she didn't even think to question it. The thief also understood that this was true. And he never thought about it. He didn't even doubt it. It was simply the natural order, the truth of their world. Could this barbarian really be questioning the very truth? Barbarians, by all accounts, were an ignorant and savage people, and they are cruel creatures, devoid of blood and tears. And that's true. But if everything he knows is true, is this man really a typical barbarian? Catalu found all this interesting and decided to ask the guys if they had rested enough. The guys all replied in unison that they had rested, and Barbarian set off again with his team. For a long time they saw nothing on their journey. But suddenly, Catal saw a light and looked and found a chest. He asked the guys what it was. The thief replied that it was a treasure chest. It was one of the rewards of the labyrinth. It belonged to Catal, if he could open it, of course. The thief understood that it was easy to talk about it, but to open a chest of such quality, you needed a master locksmith with proven skills. But a thief of this level had no business being in such a dungeon. It was a pity, of course, but it seemed they would have to leave empty-handed. Katala asked the thief to open the chest for him. The thief was surprised and did not understand why he asked him specifically. The barbarian explained that it was a chest of treasures, and Hark was a thief. The thief smiled and replied uncertainly that it was probably true. Catal asked if a robber shouldn't be dealing with chests. That's why he was asking. The thief understood that Catal was right, but there was one problem. If he could really do it, he wouldn't be in this situation. And a loser like him, who wasn't even recognized by the guild, simply didn't know how to pick locks. But he couldn't just tell him the truth. That look on his face, he hoped so much. And if he told the truth, he would be immediately disappointed. And there would be teasing about how Hark considers himself a thief, but he can't even open a chest. And they would consider him useless. But remembering how he destroyed a skeleton's skull with one blow, He also became frightened and decided to try to open it. Catal watched and marveled at the equipment thieves used to pick locks. Hark felt that the barbarian was looking right through him, and if he failed this attempt, he would not get out of here alive. He began to recall the skills he had seen while working for them as a porter. He could feel Catal's anger and pressure behind his back, and he had to risk his life. The thief put all his strength into the box and suddenly, hearing a ringing sound, said that it had opened. The priestess couldn't believe they had succeeded either. They say that only experienced thieves can open treasure chests, but to see it with her own eyes, he really is amazing. Catal was also delighted that he had managed to open the box. The thief thought it seemed impossible and didn't understand how it happened. He managed it just by assessing the situation. Is that even possible? Kasan, who had always prided himself on trying to live as well as possible, began to doubt his best for the first time in his life. And he really did live as best as possible. Catal became curious about how much it would cost. The priestess replied that such an amount would allow an ordinary family to live for about a month, and quite luxuriously at that. Catalu was surprised and understood everything. He asked Vor to take care of the reward. Suddenly, Vor took a glass out of the box, but Catal turned to him and he was very frightened. He decided to ask if he needed help. Vor replied that he hadn't done anything. Everyone was shocked and didn't understand why he was so scared. Suddenly, Catal saw skeletons ahead and stopped his people. He realized that there were 4 of them, and he could handle 3 himself. He asked them to leave the last one to him. The thief saw that this barbarian was truly frightening, but they had no choice but to agree with his decision. The others agreed as well. Catal fearlessly took the first step, and the skeletons immediately stood up. The thief saw that when he looked at them, the gathering skeletons gave him the creeps. All 4 skeletons stood up and were ready to fight to the last. Catal ordered his men to get ready, and it was time to start the fun. The thief was the first to join the fight, trying to destroy the first skeleton with his knife. But Catal grabbed 3 of them with his long arms and said that this was a rare sight and that it was not worth interfering. He would deal with them all. The paladin also did not stand aside and defended the others with his shield. Meanwhile, the thief attacked him from behind while the paladin distracted him. Trying to attack, the skeleton managed to dodge the thief's attack and remained unharmed. The priestess also saw this and used the shadow of confusion. Combining this with the paladin's attack, they managed to launch a major attack. Even after being split in 2, the skeleton continued to defend and attack. Meanwhile, Catal laughed, and after destroying the remaining skeletons, said that it was truly impressive to see the team's skills in action. And it's a pretty rare sight. And after reducing the skulls to ashes, he saw that there were no more obstacles, and it was time to enjoy the show. The thief did not stop and continued to attack excessively. The guys saw that it was as if this barbarian was testing them. Leaving 1 skeleton on guard, they stood in front of him, and he seemed to be very frightened. But the priestess told him that if he showed weakness, he would die on the spot. The guys didn't stop there and began to deliver crushing attacks, leaving only a skull. But after that, they were so tired that they sat down to rest right there. The thief believed that there was no doubt that those who had come from the snowy wasteland were indeed very strong, and the skeletons from the 3rd level of the dungeon. There were more of them, but with Catal at the helm, they advanced without any particular problems. And finally, the deepest part of the dungeon. And in this place sits the boss himself, whom they must defeat. Standing before him, they saw that it was a skeleton knight. The priestess did not believe it and did not know what he was doing here. Catal immediately said that this skeleton was different from all the others they had encountered. They believed that he was strong. The priestess understood that the skeleton knight was skilled with a sword and shield, and if he was truly a knight, they had no chance. And this was a monster they couldn't defeat. But suddenly they decided to retreat. But the priestess replied that in that case, they would need confirmation from the territory. And if they decided that it was a reasonable move, most likely everything would be fine. The priestess turned to Catala when she saw him heading towards the boss. But Catala was not afraid, and he understood that it was reasonable, and it was worth trying anyway. Standing opposite the skeleton knight, he felt very comfortable. Catala found it interesting when he saw that it was a skeleton that retained its shape. The skeleton knight immediately raised his sword and attacked with a sound wave, but the priestess anticipated this and used light protection. The knight's power was very strong, but the priestess tried to stay on her feet, even though it was difficult. The paladin also came to her defense and took the rest of the force directly onto his shield. The paladin was surprised that one blow could be so powerful, and he is too strong. But the skeleton knight did not stop after that and went on the attack. Catal stood still the whole time and was not afraid. He chose his moment and attacked with his fist. Everyone was very surprised after that. Catal slowly shook his hands and asked if that was all. Suddenly, looking to the side, he saw another box. He immediately turned to Kasan. The thief immediately became alert when he heard this. Catal asked him if he could open it. The thief shouted that it was impossible. It had a high-level lock, and he didn't have the skills to open it. Catal understood everything and was a little upset. The thief replied that he was sorry too, but they would probably have to leave the chest behind. But Catal was not satisfied with this, and he clenched his fist and broke it into 2 pieces. The thief watched with wide eyes. Catal decided that it was definitely easier to get the reward this way. He ordered Vor to take care of the rest. Vor started on the rest and couldn't believe his eyes that Catal had simply broken the chest. This was unheard of before this encounter, but if he could break it, why did he ask to open it? After their victory, they left the cave, and Catal sensed something. He immediately asked what it was. Turning around, he saw the cave collapsing, but Vor explained that if you go through the entire dungeon, it disappears, and it seemed that there was no secret room. Catal was shocked and couldn't believe that such a thing was possible. Vor replied that they were rare. Catal found all this very interesting. Upon arriving at the territory, the captain of the guard was shocked and couldn't believe that they had passed through it so quickly. But he became curious about how they liked the dungeon. Catal showed his class and replied that it was fun. Hearing these words, the guard said that he would then begin the entry procedure, and they should follow him one by one. The priestess was surprised and said that there were no serious problems. The guard asked if it was permissible to leave the barbarian in the domain. The priestess asked him if that wasn't normal, but the guard noticed that she immediately fell silent when the conversation turned to the barbarian. The entry procedure is not just about passing through the dungeon. The real goal is to identify potentially dangerous individuals. The thief also said that Catal didn't seem like a problem, and the guard saw that the barbarian had tremendous strength, but he didn't harm the team. And as he had thought all along, the barbarian was not like ordinary barbarians at all. Catal told them that Kasan was magnificent. He disarmed the traps and even opened the chest. Alessandra was also reliable as a frontline warrior. The same was true of Hayes. Her numerous prayers helped in battle. The guard was unfamiliar with this at the moment. Usually, when strangers are brought together for the sake of the dungeon, they rarely say anything good about each other. The guard made up his mind and allowed them to enter. The others also told them that permission had been granted, but if they caused any trouble, they would be expelled. And it was always best to be careful. But they still had a reward for the dungeon. It was worth dividing it among themselves. But in reality, the guards often confiscated such rewards. Catal thanked them. But the others felt that they didn't want to do that this time. But the barbarian turned out to be noble and offered to divide it fairly. The guys were surprised and replied that everything was fine, and the others were not against it either. Catal asked if they weren't one team that had fought together. The reward should be divided fairly. There was no reason to refuse. He was so happy that he suggested celebrating and heading to the pub. The team was surprised and couldn't believe his offer to celebrate, but they agreed. In fact, they just wanted him to let them go. The guard accompanied them and couldn't believe his eyes that there was a barbarian capable of knocking down a skeleton knight with one blow. And he is monstrously strong. No less than a knight, but Kettle is clearly no ordinary barbarian. He is the legendary barbarian himself. Immediately after that, the guard commander said he was going to see the Lord, and he left them at their post. Arriving at the Lord's chambers, he entered the room and wanted to report something. The Lord became curious about what he had come to report. The guard said that the first captain of the Barcan Guard was reporting. A barbarian had appeared in the domain. The Lord asked the captain if he had given him permission. The captain replied that he had decided it would not cause any serious problems. But then the Lord became curious about what was going on. The captain did not hide the fact that the barbarian was too strong, so much so that it could become a problem. The Lord decided to find out how strong he was. The captain replied that he had been told that the barbarian had defeated a skeleton knight with a single blow. The Lord was shocked to hear this, as it was the first time he had heard that the barbarian had defeated a skeleton knight with a single blow. After all, this monster is one that no one below the rank of knight should be able to defeat, and he defeated it with a single blow. But a barbarian is just an ignorant creature who solves everything with brute force. The Lord became curious. Is the barbarian first-rate? The captain replied that there was a high probability. But the Lord thought that perhaps the barbarian was even stronger. The guard replied that he could not rule it out. The Lord decided that a warrior of that level, especially a barbarian, was a problem, especially if he believed that strength gave him the right to do anything. The Lord made a conscious decision and asked the captain to summon him. The captain asked if the chieftain was sure that this was wise. The chief replied that the presence of such a strong man was in itself a source of instability. He would feel more comfortable seeing him in person. The captain said that it could be dangerous, but the Lord informed them that he had his own knight. The captain was shocked when he saw the knight, but the Lord asked him what he thought of the barbarian. The knight replied that he might have strength, but he was just a barbarian, a boor without a shred of intelligence or knowledge. And against his fencing skills, which he learned from a great swordsman, he is nothing. The Lord ordered the captain to summon the barbarian. He would speak with him personally. Meanwhile, the barbarian was in a pub, relaxing after a difficult mission with his team. The guys watched him eat and were shocked. Catal said it was delicious. He liked the atmosphere, and he liked how quiet it was here. And he treated them, and they could eat as much as they wanted. Catal suddenly turned to the paladin and asked if he was a holy knight. The paladin replied that this was correct. But the barbarian became curious about what divine power he used. He hadn't seen the paladin use it in the dungeon. The paladin replied that he was still learning, so his divine power had not yet awakened. Catal said he was very sorry. But then he turned to the priestess and remembered that she had once said that she worshipped Colossia. Was there a temple nearby? The priestess replied that there wasn't. Most likely that wasn't the case. Usually she wasn't particularly welcome. She understood that Colossia was the goddess of lies and deceit, a goddess rejected and exiled by most. But the priestess couldn't help herself and asked the barbarian how strong he was. Catal was not surprised and replied that in terms of rank, he had recently left the snowy wasteland. So he was also curious, but he himself did not know how strong a skeleton knight was. The priestess replied that to fight him, one must be at least second rank. And probably, a first-class warrior could defeat someone like Mr. Catal. Catal now understood what was considered second rank, but suddenly the pub manager approached them and said it was time to close. Catal apologized and replied that they were already wrapping up. But before leaving, he asked the guys if they all had plans or things to do. The guys immediately replied that they were already busy. Catal was upset and decided to say goodbye to them. He would miss their team. But in reality, they didn't want to see him anymore. When he got home, Catal lay down on the sofa and relaxed deeply. It was the first time he had lain in bed since he had arrived here. It was very good that he could afford a room thanks to the reward for the dungeon. But compared to the wasteland, this was paradise. Since he woke up there, it took a long time to reach civilization. But he doesn't know what to do next, and he really wants to experience more and feel more. Catal looked at his hand and realized that he wanted adventure. The plan included the sacred lands of the elves, the Tower of Magic, the royal capital. In the morning, Catal opened his eyes and felt his mouth water with joy and delight. He opened the door and saw that the captain had arrived. The guard apologized for waking him up. Catal wondered if something had happened. The captain replied that the Lord wanted to see him personally. Catal was shocked to hear about the Lord. He understood that he owned this territory and that he was the master of the land, and such a man wanted to meet with him. Catal did not refuse and immediately agreed, but the guard did not leave and waited for him. Catal asked him to take his clothes and go to him. The captain of the guard was shocked that he agreed so easily. Could they really have found the guy? Catal remembered that when he first entered this territory, it was just a regular slum. He only glanced at it briefly. But now, seeing it in daylight, it was a completely different matter, and it even became interesting. If this was a happy fantasy, he would gladly accept it at any moment. The captain of the guard sensed that the barbarian was doing something behind him, but he didn't understand why. But in reality, there was little time. He needed to block as many lines of sight as possible. The captain of the guard arrived at the house and informed the lord that he had brought the barbarian. The Lord ordered him to enter. He showed him hospitality and, extending his hand, said he was glad to meet him. Catal shook his hand in response and replied that he was also glad to meet the rightful ruler of these lands. The Lord was greatly surprised by the barbarian's gesture, for he had bowed to him. But as he remembered, barbarians never bowed. For them, strength was everything. But it seemed that if you lived long enough, you could see everything. The Lord saw that the barbarian was well-mannered and invited him to sit at the table. Catal sat down at the table and began to look around, seeing that the castle looked very good. Even in a fantasy world, castles are like those in the Middle Ages. Suddenly, he noticed a knight standing behind the Lord. He remembered that he often played knights as a child and never thought he would see a real one. And it was so cool, just as he had imagined. But at that moment, the knight sensed the barbarian's murderous intent, and it was definitely a thirst for blood. And to show this in the presence of the Lord, he must be a fool, and he won't leave here alive either. The Lord said directly that the reason he had summoned him was simple. There were a few questions he wanted to clarify. Catal was not afraid and began to listen, but he asked what the Lord wanted to know. The Lord asked him where he came from. Catal understood that this was an important question for him. He came from the coldest place in the world, from a world covered in snow. The Lord immediately understood that he was from the white, snowy wasteland, and he was indeed the legendary barbarian, and such a creature now stood before him. But the Lord informed him that he was saying things that were difficult to believe. The barbarian explained that it was a terrible place. Whether to believe him or not was up to the Lord to decide. Then the Lord decided to ask another question. How strong was the barbarian really? He needed to understand how dangerous his strength was. But Catal replied that this was the wrong question. He did not know the local system of strength. But Lord looked at his knight and asked, how about a duel with his knight? He would make sure the barbarian received a worthy reward for it. Catal was surprised to hear about the duel, but the Lord said that it was not a fight to the death, and he hoped that he would not cross the line. Catal replied that everything suited him. He understood that this knight was not an ordinary one. A knight from a fantasy world, possessing mystical powers and an aura, the opportunity to see his technique up close. It would be interesting. Lord understood that a barbarian remains a barbarian. No matter how polite he behaved, he did not hide his thirst for battle. That same day, they immediately went to the arena where the fights were held. Catal behaved very calmly and was not nervous. The Lord was in a very serious mood and ordered the duel to begin, hoping that there would be no bloodshed. Hearing the ringing of the bell, the knight told the barbarian that he could consider it an honor to see his fencing skills. The barbarian replied that he would like that too. But the knight did not understand how the barbarian dared to say such a thing and behave so calmly. And now he would show him what a knight was capable of. He used his overwhelming strength advantage and watched to see what the barbarian would do. Using his sword in battle, Catal was shocked and did not understand why he saw 3 swords in front of his face. He thought it was an illusion, but then realized it wasn't. All 3 swords were real, and he called it fencing. Dodging all attacks, he was right. But the knight thought that the barbarian's abilities were barely enough to dodge his attacks. And he believes that this in itself is impressive, but after that he will not slow down. But Catal simply waved his finger and broke his sword into small pieces. The knight was shocked and did not understand what had happened. Then the barbarian simply walked up to him and grabbed his shield. Clenching his fist, he destroyed his shield and sent him flying into the wall. The Lord watched this and was shocked. The knight couldn't handle such force and crashed into the wall. The Lord couldn't believe that a high-level knight had been defeated with a single blow. What kind of monstrous strength was this? Catal asked if that was all. The Lord replied that it was. He realized that a barbarian capable of defeating a high-level knight with a single blow had monstrous strength, and at least superhuman. But that was only the minimum. The true depth of his strength was impossible to gauge, and a barbarian with such strength could simply upset the balance of the world, and in that case, he should be informed. One of the few in this world who bears the title of Master Swordsman. He understood that this person would arrive soon, and he was even curious to see if it would interest him. Suddenly, that very person approached and asked what would interest him. The Lord was surprised and replied that his interests were still as disgusting as ever. The old man laughed and replied that he needed to entertain himself somehow. And now the Lord was going to tell him about a matter that might interest him. The Lord stood up and replied that it was an honor for them to welcome Master Cain. At that moment, the knight was lying in the room, trying to pull himself together from the pain. Suddenly, the door opened and the Lord asked him how he was feeling. The knight immediately stood up and replied that he would be better in a couple of days. He apologized to the Lord. Cain made it clear to him that he did not need to apologize to the Lord, since his foolish student had been defeated by some nameless barbarian. Hearing his master's voice, he jumped out of bed, but Cain saw that his student didn't even have a scratch on him. In fact, he saw the armor, which was smashed to pieces. Judging by its condition, he would not have been surprised if the student had been dead. And yet, apart from torn clothes, his body was intact. Could it be that the barbarian had spared him? Cain reasoned that the barbarian was not just a mad savage. He was someone who knew how to control his strength, and he did so with remarkable precision. The knight did not understand this and did not even know if it was true. But Cain explained that the barbarian was so superior to the knight that he could afford to be merciful, and he was, at the very least, superhuman. But the Lord thought about it and said that it might sound harsh, but compared to him, Cain interrupted him and made them understand that the barbarian was quite strong, but he was a master of the sword. Even if the barbarian possessed superhuman strength, he was no match for him. But the barbarian did not use his aura. Of course, it is surprising that the barbarian is capable of such strength without it. And it is impossible by ordinary means. It is the power of the barbarian from the white wasteland. The Lord didn't believe it at first, but he says it's true, that he really is from there. Cain understood that the barbarian from the white wasteland was a legendary figure, about whom there were only rumors. He explained to the guys that the barbarian was completely different. But he had some doubts. The Lord didn't understand what the master was talking about. But Cain said that if the barbarian were someone else, he would not have spared the man, and that meant he was wrong. But still, the white wasteland. And why did someone from there appear right now, he wondered. Lord saw the master's gaze and decided to ask if something was wrong, but Cain replied that everything was fine, and that this was a topic for another time. He makes the strangest requests, but Cain told them that there was nothing to worry about now. But he became curious. Was the barbarian in this domain now? The Lord replied that it was true. He had said something about staying, but Cain decided he would have to see for himself. The captain of the guards met with the barbarian one last time and decided to find out what he was going to do now. Catal replied that he wasn't sure yet, but the captain interrupted him and handed him a bag, saying it was his reward for the duel. And from that moment on, the Lord would not interfere with what he did in this territory. But Catal explained that he had no definite plans, but it would be nice if he had at least some official status. And he thinks that going into the dungeons every time he moves to a new territory is a bad idea. The captain replied that one option was to find a patron with high status to vouch for him. But Catal saw that the captain wasn't finished and asked what else there was. The captain suggested that he become a mercenary. If he earned a reputation and gained the recognition of the guild, his status could be officially recognized. But if a mercenary did not reach a certain level, he was essentially just an errand boy. With strength like this barbarian's, it would be wiser to find a patron. Catal was shocked and decided to find out if that was possible. The captain explained that a mercenary was someone who took orders to kill monsters, and the barbarian thought that this was the ultimate fantasy dream. In that case, he made up his mind and immediately decided to find out where he should go to become a mercenary. The captain replied that there was a guild building. The barbarian said he would be grateful if he could show him the way. In reality, mercenaries are wanderers who take on all kinds of tasks. Some people find their life romantic. But in reality, mercenaries without status are at the bottom of society. Even capable mercenaries often die trying to clear unknown dungeons and become cannon fodder for dirty work. Therefore, the lowest class of mercenaries is filth, shame, and constant fighting. At that moment, a brawl was taking place in the mercenary guild building. One mercenary punched another because he started messing with the wrong person. But the second mercenary was persistent and saw that the man wanted to fight him. The man was not intimidated by such words and called the mercenary various names with gestures. Meanwhile, the other mercenaries watched the fight and said they were betting on the guy on the right, urging him to win. The second mercenary replied that he had bet on the guy on the left. The mercenaries continued to fight and pull each other's hair. The manager suddenly asked a girl named Rosa how she liked the new recruits today. Rosa replied that everything was terrible. She was the registrar of the mercenary guild, and she thought the recruits were strange. In fact, one of them pretended to be a holy knight, but he was completely insane. There was even a thief among them. The nun seemed normal, but because of who she served, she wasn't particularly trusted either. The manager didn't believe her and considered it a failure. Rosa saw that there wasn't a single normal person here, and these thick-headed mercenaries did nothing but fight all day long. And if a handsome, brave prince on a white horse appeared and rescued her from this office drudgery. But suddenly the door opened and only a person's foot was visible. Rosa was shocked when she saw this. Upon entering, Catal saw the guild building. The mercenaries looked at him and were shocked. They saw a real barbarian. Catal approached the registration desk and said that he had come to become a mercenary. Rosa couldn't believe that a barbarian wanted to register as a mercenary. She asked him why he wanted to become a mercenary. Catal explained that there were several reasons, but he had heard that it gave him official status. Rosa replied that this was true, but in order to be granted status, he would have to work hard, and she asked if the barbarian was ready for that. Catal immediately agreed. Rosa registered him and asked him for 5 copper coins. She also asked him to give his name and age. Catal introduced himself and said that he was not sure of his age. Rosa decided that he would simply indicate his approximate age. Rosa did everything and said that the registration was complete. And here is his mercenary badge. It confirms his status, and he should not lose sight of it. Catal took his badge and immediately decided to find out what tasks were available. He wanted to get to work right away. Rosa handed him a piece of paper and said that these were the available tasks for Mr. Kettle. The barbarian looked at it and couldn't believe that these were all the tasks. Rosa explained that since he had an F rank, these were the only tasks they could offer him. She had heard that barbarians were very proud. If he suddenly became enraged, she would not know what to do. It might be best to call for help. Rosa said that if he started with something simple and gained experience, more serious tasks would become available over time. Catal immediately agreed to take on one task. Rosa asked him if he was sure. Catal replied that it was just work. He had no problem with that. He immediately decided to find out where to collect the herbs. Rosa showed him a picture and told him where they were. Catal took the picture and immediately went to gather them. Rosa thought the barbarian was surprisingly calm. But Catal did not get upset and went to find the herbs. After that, Catal arrived at the location and found the first herb on the mercenaries' list. He understood that those herbs were good for wounds, but they looked a little strange. Catal undressed and remembered that he had brought sun protection with him. It was time to complete his first mercenary job. About an hour later, he arrived at the mercenary guild and brought a huge bag of herbs. Catal asked if it was enough. Rosa replied that it was a lot. She didn't understand that the barbarian was a criminal genius who had come to destroy the entire field of herbs. She saw that they were in excellent condition. Most mercenaries simply uproot them like savages, and then they lose their value. Catal explained that he might not look like it, but he was very careful. Rosa placed a coin on the table and, thanking him for his work, gave him his reward. She handed him 1 silver coin, and that would barely be enough for the cheapest meal. But still, it was the first money he had earned through honest labor. He was even a little touched. Catal replied that he was very pleased and asked if he could take on the next task. Rosa couldn't believe that a barbarian could be satisfied with such payment. Catal explained that the sun was still high and he wanted to get as much done as possible. And that's why he looked genuinely happy. And now she also thought that this mercenary was a weirdo, and just like the other mercenaries. Catal continued to complete all the tasks and decided to take the next one. Rosa was shocked, because it was the 3rd cleaning after gathering herbs. She thought that the barbarian liked to clean. Rosa said that she would like to ask for his help. Catal went into the room and said that he had come to clean the warehouse. The girl, seeing such a huge man, was simply stunned with surprise. Catal decided to ask her if she was the owner of the warehouse. The girl replied with a trembling voice that she was. Cleaning the warehouse was easy for him, and moving things around inside turned out to be not difficult. The next task was to clean the streets. He took a broom and swept the floor. At first it was difficult to control his strength, but in the end, there were no problems. The swordmaster watched the barbarian and did not understand why he was doing all these things. He was clearly no weaker than a superhuman, and he had enough power to change the course of the kingdom's history if he wanted to. In other words, if he showed his power, he would be accepted anywhere. And yet this barbarian, accustomed to forceful solutions, takes on such trivial tasks. And he doesn't do it half-heartedly. He takes it very seriously. The swordmaster still couldn't understand why he was doing this, but Katal was very pleased. The next morning, Katalu got up early and saw a bag on the shelf. Rosa congratulated him on a job well done for his first day. And here is your reward for completing all 5 tasks. She said there were 15 silver coins in it. Katal was delighted and promised to come back tomorrow, and he decided to start his second day in civilization. When he went outside, people were very afraid of him, and children began to cry. Suddenly, Barbarian stopped on his way and saw a library nearby. He made up his mind and immediately went inside. The employee who saw him was speechless. Katal greeted her and asked if she would mind if he read some books. The employee did not refuse him and let him in. Katal found it all interesting and headed for the books. The swordmaster was shocked that the so-called ignorant and wild barbarian was reading a book. He couldn't see him from where he was standing, but he could definitely feel his presence. But he couldn't believe that the barbarians from the snowy wasteland were more cultured than ordinary people. Or maybe this barbarian was just special. Meanwhile, Katalu closed the history book. He read and learned that the empire had ultimately won, and not long ago, it had come to the snowy wasteland. And it said it was heading to the kingdom that was at war with the empire to sell weapons. And it seems that the war ended with the empire's victory. The current empire seems incredibly powerful, so much so that the kingdom of Barkan is now a vassal. The empire has absorbed half of the human world and continues to advance. It seems as if it wants to absorb the whole world. Suddenly, Katal decided that he wanted to finish with human affairs for today, and now to what he really wanted to study. He wanted to learn more about non-humans. And this is the very book that collects non-humans, fantastic records gathered here. And they really exist in this world. The largest cave in the world, where minerals are piled up like garbage. The cave of the gnomes, Gulmantamia. And there is also the village of the fairies of Pisarapia, the air city of the celestials of Lagamaria. And finally, there is an unknown sacred land that no one can remember, the sacred sanctuary of all elves, Elfo Sagrada. No one really knows where it is. Even the most powerful have tried to find it by all means, but have failed. And just now, Katal received the exclusive right to visit the sanctuary of the elves. Suddenly, he saw something interesting, and thought that there were other places similar to the wasteland. These are demonic worlds, places where humans are forbidden to enter, and which are full of distorted creatures and anomalies. There are quite a few demonic worlds, but there are 5 that are especially huge. The Forest of Silence, which silently colors everything around it. The Abyss, pulling the world into the depths of evil. The Deep Sea, where primates live and breathe. And then there is a deep hole in which there is nothing, and a white snowy wasteland. The demonic worlds are inhabited by terrifying monsters called anomalies. However, the demonic worlds cannot spread to the human worlds. Katalu became curious about how big this world was. The wasteland alone was huge, and to think that there were several such places. And now he thinks that's all he needed. He thanked the worker and said it was very informative. Katalu went to work and asked if there were any assignments for today. Rosa was glad that the master had returned. She gave him a task sheet. The swordmaster understood that this task was quite unusual, and he thinks he will have to meet with him in person. In the evening, Katal was already heading home after another day. He had completed more than a dozen tasks today. Even such small tasks add up over time. It's quite profitable. And if he continued in the same vein, the day when he would be recognized as a real mercenary would come sooner. Meanwhile, the swordmaster was still watching him. But at that moment, he decided to confront the barbarian. Katal told the old man that he had been watching him all day. The swordmaster was shocked and had no idea that he had been exposed. The barbarian decided to ask him what he wanted. The swordmaster did not understand how he had noticed him. He had clearly given himself away with his aura. No matter how sharp his instincts were, it was impossible to sense him. Katal clenched his coins and decided to ask the old man if he was a bandit. The swordmaster did not know how to respond. Katal decided that since he was silent, it must be true. Even in places with good security, bandits can be found. The old man did not know if the barbarian would believe him if he explained that he was a swordmaster. Catal asked him what had happened to make him resort to robbery in his old age. It seemed that the economy was indeed in decline, and if he caught him, it would be quite an achievement for him. The swordmaster did not understand what the barbarian was talking about. He thought it was not a bad opportunity. He mistook him for a bandit, and perhaps the best way to fight him directly and learn his strength and personality. Catal approached him and suddenly disappeared right before his eyes. The swordmaster was surprised and did not know how he did it. Turning around, he saw that the barbarian was already in front of him. The swordmaster realized that if he remained standing, the barbarian would grab him by the throat. Catal tried to grab him, but the swordmaster used his speed and dodged to the side. Catalu liked that. He praised the old man for being quite fast. But the swordmaster didn't believe it, because the barbarian had almost caught him. If he had reacted a fraction of a second later, he would have been caught. But even more striking was that he did not feel any aura from the barbarian at all. Catalu smiled and saw that the old man was moving so fast only with the help of his human body. But the old man also believed that this was no longer just a test, and he was going to give it his all. But Catal did not slow down either, and using his powers, he easily grabbed his hand. The old man did not understand how this was possible, because he had definitely strengthened his perception. And yet he did not have time to react, and he felt that it wasn't just a feeling that he had been grabbed. It was as if his hand was stuck in a boulder that was pulling his whole body. Catal squeezed his hand, and the swordmaster felt the strength and did not understand how great it was. He couldn't even compete with it. And in that case, he would give it his all and unleash all his power. Catal continued to squeeze his hand and suddenly saw a light. It flashed so brightly that the swordmaster broke free. Standing opposite the barbarian, he looked at him as if he were a target. Catal said that bandits really did have a lot of tricks up their sleeves these days. The swordmaster didn't know why the barbarian kept calling him a bandit. And this is the materialization of mana. Only those who stand at the top among living warriors are capable of this. But why would someone like him engage in such a petty thing as robbery? And the barbarian really thinks it's some kind of bandit trick. The old man actually materialized mana automatically. It is capable of tearing even hardened steel. A normal human body would have been torn apart the moment it came into contact with it. But this guy doesn't have a scratch on him. What's wrong with this body? He can withstand materialized mana with his bare hands. Catal said that the old man was using some kind of interesting technique, but he thought it was time to end it. The swordmaster tried to grab the sword, but the barbarian moved very quickly and stopped him with his finger. The old man tried to pull the sword out, but he couldn't. Meanwhile, Catal had already put his hand in front of his face to grab his head. He realized that this was the end for him. Catal knocked him out with one blow and realized that this is what a bandit looks like in a fantasy world. After that, the barbarian met with the captain, and the captain asked him, "What is this?" Catal did not explain anything and showed him the swordmaster he had fought. The captain of the guard didn't understand what was going on. And why was the swordmaster Cain here? He thought that the barbarian had attacked the swordmaster, and then what would happen now? The barbarian explained that he had caught a thief. The captain was shocked to hear about the thief. Catal decided that if he handed him over to the guards, it would be considered mercenary work. The captain still couldn't understand what was going on. A man who had reached the heights of superhuman strength, the swordmaster Cain, and such a man was being held by a barbarian, in such a humiliating position. The captain informed him that this old man was not a thief. The barbarian realized that the captain knew him, and it seemed that he was an accomplice to the criminal. The captain said that he was the only swordmaster in the kingdom, and he welcomed the swordmaster Cain. Catal was shocked and did not understand what kind of swordmaster he was. It was a title that sounded so majestic, and yet he was a thief. Catal stood his ground and still believed that it was impossible and that he was a thief. He attacked him because of the silver coins. The captain replied that no, he really was a swordmaster. It was impossible to mistake this face. Catal suggested that it was possible that he was also a magician who could change his appearance. The captain replied that if he were such a high-level mage, he would already be respected as a master swordsman. The barbarian asked if perhaps master swordsman was just a nickname used by thieves. The captain was already angry and decided to ask him what he was talking about. The barbarian asked again if he was really a master swordsman. The captain replied that it was true. But the captain decided to report this to the lord first. Upon hearing this, the Lord stood up and was so shocked that he couldn't understand how Lord Cain had been defeated. Catal also apologized and realized that he should have listened to the whole story. But Cain explained that this was not the case, that it was his fault for not saying anything. The Lord did not understand what kind of situation this was. He expected Lord Cain to challenge the barbarian to a duel, but he did not expect him to lose. Lord Cain was defeated by the barbarian. He doesn't know the details, but it's obvious. In other words, this barbarian is stronger than a master swordsman. Of course, even among superhumans, there are different levels. Lord Cain only recently became a master swordsman, so his level must be the lowest among superhumans. But still, he bears the great title of Swordmaster, Lord of the Sword. So for a barbarian to defeat a swordmaster means that he is a completely uncontrollable being. Meanwhile, Lord Cain's head was already aching from such thoughts. The Lord said that judging by what he had heard, there had been a misunderstanding. He declined. The two of them needed to talk alone first. Standing opposite the old man, they exchanged glances. The old man found this moment extremely humiliating. But it was a complete defeat. He couldn't even justify himself. And his pride was not just wounded, it was torn to shreds. Cain did not keep him waiting long and introduced himself to the barbarian. Catal was surprised and decided to find out if Master of the Sword was his surname. Cain explained that when the barbarian himself reached the level of a sword master, the surname would lose all meaning. But the barbarian became curious. Was what Cain had used earlier the technique of a sword master? Cain was surprised and, demonstrating the technique, asked him if he was talking about him. Catal was surprised, because at first he thought it was just a thief's technique and didn't think much of it. But knowing that it was a sword master's skill, it was truly impressive. Cain explained that it was a manifestation of mysticism. It is also called an aura. Catal was curious about everything and asked if this technique was an aura, and he wondered how he could learn to use it. Cain replied that in essence, one must control mysticism and manifest it. The barbarian thought that mysticism was similar to mana, but Cain replied that mysticism meant mystical energy itself. When used as an aura, it becomes the domain of swordsmen. When used as mana, it belongs to mages. Catal now understood that mages and swordsmen could use it. He asked the old man to teach him this technique. Unfortunately, he was still expanding his insufficient knowledge. He asked him to teach him this. Cain couldn't refuse him and agreed. But he became curious. Is there a reason why he is asking him for advice? And wasn't the barbarian stronger than himself? Catal replied that he knew nothing about mysticism or fencing. He just swung his sword without any knowledge. Cain did not understand if this was true. He was a master swordsman. Although he had been defeated, he had not even drawn his sword, and it was good that he taught the barbarian the way of the sword and showed him the greatness of fencing. And he would restore his trampled pride. Cain agreed, and since he was a master swordsman, without a weapon he was no more than half a man. Catal thought so, and it was no surprise that they seemed so weak, since he did not use a sword. Cain replied that this was indeed the case. But the barbarian thought that calling himself a master swordsman with such a level of strength was strange, and if he had used his sword, they might have won. The old man wondered if he really would have won just by drawing his sword. Catal was actually looking forward to it. The old man believed that he would regain his self-respect. Cain remembered that before his regression, he had studied fencing itself, but this was real fantasy fencing. A strange form of fencing that uses the mysterious power of the aura. Cain began to say that the most distinctive feature of his style was the materialization of illusions. And when he fought his student, what did Varva see? Barbarian asked him if that knight was his student. The sword strike split into 3 parts, and they were all real strikes. And that's what he meant by materialization, and a style closer to mastery than to strength. Cain said that was right. And fencing is the art of merging the sword and the aura to control mystical power. And those who reach the end of this path become masters of the sword. And now the barbarian loudly realized what an aura was, but the swordmaster still couldn't believe it. Cain explained that the materialization of illusion may seem difficult to understand, and he couldn't believe that he was actually teaching the barbarian fencing. So he decided to show him himself. Cain wasted no time and demonstrated his fencing skills. He made one strike directly at the ground, and the energy dissolved several meters ahead. The barbarian realized that this strike had split into 5 parts, and there was a mark on the wall with such force. He said outright that there are many techniques that create illusions using aura, but only his style allows them to take physical form, and this is truly a mystical technique. What would the barbarians say to that now? Catal replied that he thought he could do it too. The master did not believe him and considered his words to be nonsense. He was a master who had devoted his entire life to the sword. Natural talent, grueling training. That's how he struggled to reach this level. It was impossible to copy this just by seeing it once. Catal picked up his sword and said it would be faster if he just showed him. The master saw his weapon and did not understand why he was holding an axe. Catal began to swing his axe and try to demonstrate this technique. The master was surprised because he saw that the barbarian was simply moving quickly, relying on his strength. He was able to do it, and when he sent the attack straight into the wall, it turned out to be even more powerful, because there was a huge explosion. The master watched all this with his mouth open, but the barbarian smiled and asked what he thought. The master understood that it looked like his strike, but it only seemed that way because of the monstrous strength and speed. Even he almost believed it. The master told the barbarian that he had simply swung his axe. There was no technique involved, let alone any aura. But Catal believed that the result was similar, and that fencing was created for real combat. He thought that even if there was a difference, it was almost irrelevant. The master thought that the barbarian was not entirely wrong, but it still hurt his pride. And now he decided to demonstrate something else to him, and show him. He used his magic and showed him the technique of the air aura. Catal saw that the master's body simply split apart, and in the end, there was an explosion, leaving huge marks on the ground after such a technique. He said that this separation of the body was achieved through absolute control over the aura. Cain asked him if he could repeat it. Catal did not answer and headed towards the repetition. Catal did not get distracted and demonstrated the same thing, while the master watched it all with amazement. He created a vortex of such magnitude that it turned into a hurricane. When he finished, he asked the master for his decision. The master knelt before him and wept with humiliation. He understood that the fencing he had honed all his life was incredible. He couldn't believe that some barbarian from the snowy wasteland could do such a thing. The barbarian said that the master's spirit was weaker than he thought, and his fencing was impressive. And he just swung an axe. It wasn't real fencing. But the style he showed wasn't empty. It was real, and he would never be able to achieve such mastery. Cain also understood and knew that his fencing was still valued. And the materialization of illusion is a technique that only he can use, and it's not about the weakness of his style. And he thinks this barbarian is just crazy. What kind of madman can move so fast to create something like that without an aura? But this is beyond human capabilities. And suddenly, the barbarian asked to be taught the technique of fencing. Cain apologized, overcome with emotion for a moment. The barbarian replied that he understood. But the swordmaster explained that in order to master the real techniques, he must first learn to control his aura. But to control the aura, he must awaken the mystic. No mage, swordsman, or witch can reach the highest level without awakening the mystic, and only those who believe in the gods can achieve this. Catal suddenly asked, "Is divine power different?" The swordmaster replied that miracles are granted directly by the gods. They do not particularly depend on personal abilities. Mysticism is exactly what it sounds like. It is a mysterious power hidden within everyone, and how one controls it determines everything. After all, in order to master the aura, gain mana, or command spirits, the first step to all these powers is the awakening of mysticism. There are 5 stages of mysticism. The most basic stage is to feel mysticism. It is a state of awareness, awakening, and feeling mysticism. Catal asked, "So not everyone is capable of feeling it?" The swordmaster replied that without talent, he would not even be able to sense it, and those who are able to feel it are given the 3rd rank. Depending on their ability to control mysticism, one of 5 ranks is assigned. The 3rd rank is the initial one. Usually the ranks are 3rd, 2nd, 1st, superhuman, and hero. There are 5 categories in total. And now Catal remembered that it was that thing. The master continued to say that, in general, it was just a convenient classification system. There is a huge difference between the ranks, and they are not always clearly separated. It is enough to simply understand the general idea. Catal understood everything, and the master suggested he begin. he decided to show him the first stage of feeling mysticism. He told the barbarian to feel everything around him. Then he would feel the mystical mana, awakening a new sensation that he had never experienced before. Then he needed to expand his senses as much as he could. But he should also feel the movement of the passing wind, the cold of the earth and the swaying wind. And inside this, a separate presence, moving within. The barbarian tried to do this, but he still felt nothing. The swordmaster was a little surprised, because he thought someone as strong as the barbarian would be able to feel it. And it's not a strict law, but those who are strong even without mana usually have a better chance of feeling the mystical. But apparently this barbarian was an exception. And perhaps this was a characteristic of people born in the snowy wasteland. The barbarian knew nothing, because no one around him had ever felt what they called mystical. The master said that feeling the mystical was not easy at first. So this time, he would transfer his energy to him and open the way to mysticism. The barbarian was surprised and asked if he was transferring his aura. The swordmaster replied that it was something like that. The barbarian became very interested and told him to start doing it. The master approached him from behind and told him to relax his whole body and focus his senses on his physical body. Then he should feel the mana that he would transmit to him. The swordmaster was shocked and did not understand what kind of body the barbarian had, and it was indeed a human body. He felt it was as hard as a rock and became curious about how many muscles the barbarian had. Katal looked and saw that the master was distracted. The swordmaster apologized and thought for a moment. He immediately began to transfer the aura, and most importantly, to awaken the mystical power slumbering inside the body. And soon they would find the way. It wasn't that difficult. But for a moment he paused and didn't understand what it was. After all, he couldn't find the way to the mystical power inside his body. More precisely, he couldn't reach it. And no matter how far he extended his aura, he could not reach or see anything. It was like swimming in the deep sea of the abyss. But even that's not quite right. It was like moving through space with such pressure that it could crush him to death. The swordmaster said it wouldn't work. The barbarian was surprised and decided to ask him what he meant. And it goes without saying that he didn't see any talent in him. The swordmaster replied that no, that wasn't it. It wasn't enough to simply transfer the aura into his body. In the end, in order to find mystical power, the barbarian had to find the path within himself and awaken the dormant power. The barbarian understood that he knew this, but still, the master explained that he had not been able to find mystical power in his body. But the barbarian couldn't believe it, because the master couldn't feel mystical power at all, could he? The master replied that this was not the case. He couldn't even check it. The barbarian asked him what he meant. Keen replied that the barbarian's physical body was special, and in order to embark on the mystical path, the aura must penetrate deep into the body. But his body was dense and heavy, and the aura couldn't even penetrate his body normally. This was also a first for him. Who would have thought that pure physical strength could block the aura? The barbarian realized that even a master swordsman couldn't do it. He asked if he really couldn't obtain any mystical power. The swordmaster replied that it was difficult to say. In the end, he couldn't confirm it, and he couldn't even understand whether there was a path to mysticism or not. Perhaps he should consult other swordmasters who are skilled in aura, or go to the magic tower. In any case, he apologized. The barbarian replied that everything was fine, but he understood that there was still a chance. For now, that was enough. And yet, thanks to the swordmaster, he will learn a lot, and he appreciates it. The barbarians he had met before were all bloodthirsty animals. They lived for plunder, and all they wanted was alcohol and violence. That is why barbarians were outcasts to all peoples. But this barbarian is different. The swordmaster thought that the barbarian would like to stay in this kingdom. The barbarian asked him what he meant. The master replied that he meant to swear allegiance to the kingdom and receive a title, and with his help, he would receive a high position. He would be his patron. The barbarian found this interesting, but he refused. He had no desire to obey anyone. The master wanted to subjugate this barbarian to a suzerain, and perhaps they could even free themselves from the empire's rule. But still, the barbarian could receive a noble title. Isn't that tempting? The barbarian thought about it and replied that he wanted to enjoy life as he pleased. The master understood his words and said no more. But the barbarian thanked him anyway, and he would not forget this favor. The swordmaster left, realizing that it was a ridiculous idea. For a moment he thought he could control him, but no one can. This barbarian is too headstrong. He may be part of a group, but nothing more. His only compass is his own will, and he couldn't understand this barbarian. So in a sense, he might even be more dangerous than other barbarians, and a creature from the demonic world. The swordmaster thought that an expedition to the demon world was a good idea. What was His Majesty thinking? The lord sitting at the table also said that this was the first time he had heard that His Majesty the Emperor wished to conquer the demon world. Cain replied that many lives would be lost in vain under the pretext of exploration. The lord decided to ask him if he was serious. The swordmaster replied that it was all true, and maybe he wanted to be the second coming of the ancient emperor. In any case, all that would come later. They had not even conquered all the kingdoms of the human race yet. The lord believed that the time would come anyway. The swordmaster replied that since these were also imperial lands, a challenge might come. It was better to know about it in advance. And the world is strange enough. And now even the emperor seems half mad. It's all such a headache. The lord was shocked and asked if these were just rumors. The swordmaster replied that it was all true. The movements of the demons are becoming noticeable, and the frequency of dungeon appearances is also unusual. It's not certain, but there are rumors that the distortion of the demon world is breaking through into their world. And what is happening is clearly not good for humanity. And when you think about it, isn't it strange that it is already here? The lord agreed with the swordmaster. Cain became curious about what the lord himself thought about it. The lord replied that he did not know. At least, it had not shown any hostility towards them. But he was not sure about the rest. The next day, Catal was walking around the city and noticed that passers-by were crying and frightened of him. He realized that they were panicking and afraid because of his clothes, and he thinks it's because he's not wearing the right clothes. But the animal skin vest was nice, but he thought it wasn't considered civilized clothing. They probably thought he was crazy and wanted to stay away from him, and Catal decided that he would buy decent clothes. When he went to the clothing store, the clerk was very surprised. Catal said he would like to buy some clothes. The employee was shocked at the sight of a real barbarian. He apologized and replied that they did not have clothes in his size. The barbarian decided to find out if there was any way he could find clothes that fit him. But the employee replied that if he gave them time, they could make something custom for him. Catal was delighted and asked them to sew clothes for him. The employee said he would contact him when everything was ready. But he thought that if the barbarian didn't like the result, his life would be over. Suddenly, on his way to the guild, he saw a ball on the ground and became curious about what it was. He picked up the tiny stone and thought it was a precious gem. He decided to put the stone in his bag and simply ask about it at the guild. When he arrived at Rosa's, he asked her if she knew what it was and told her that he had found it on his way there. Rosa looked at the stone, and the barbarian thought that this stone was not ordinary. Rosa said that it did not look like a precious stone. Judging by its smooth surface, it was probably the work of a master craftsman, and there was no name on it, and it looked quite valuable, at least at first glance. Suddenly, Catal twitched his finger, and Rosa was startled. He asked her if everything was okay. Rosa asked him what he meant. Barbarian replied that it seemed to him that the stone was drawing her consciousness. Rosa didn't understand what he was talking about, but the barbarian didn't believe in such things either. Rosa explained that, in any case, this ball was difficult to identify, and she thought it had some kind of strange energy. She asked the barbarian if she should try to evaluate it. Catal thanked her and replied that he would figure it out himself. This was also interesting. And now something else was more important. What tasks were there today? Rosa replied that she would bring the task forms. She brought the form and placed it in front of him. Catal looked at it and immediately began to work on it. After a hard day's work, he came home with his money and lay down on the bed to rest. Lying on the sofa, he looked at the ball and wondered what kind of thing it was. Rosa looked as if she was mesmerized by it, but did it have any function? Suddenly, he jumped up from the bed and heard the voice of the sphere asking him to come closer. The barbarian asked why he could hear a voice coming from the sphere. Inside Catal's mind, he heard the voice of the sphere. The barbarian realized that the ball was asking him to go to some kind of storage facility, and the ball even kindly sent instructions directly to his head. And perhaps it was some kind of magic of submission. The stone was still asking him to come closer. The barbarian stared out the window and wondered whether he should go. The sphere kept repeating that he should come. The barbarian was already on his way and asked it to be quiet. When he arrived, he saw a tunnel and realized that it was inside. Once inside, the ball screamed even louder and could be heard. Catal said he had arrived and asked where the one who had called him was. Shah replied that another victim had arrived, and this time it was a stupid barbarian, and judging by his size, he should be a good victim. The Black Skull said that the time had come, and there was still a little time left before the resurrection. In the past, there was a time of chaos when many kingdoms were destroyed. Behind it all was an evil sorcerer who manipulated emotions and disturbed the peace. He subjugated the minds of countless kings, unleashed wars, and ruled kingdoms. But his excessive evil was eventually exposed, and the hunt for him began. However, just before his defeat, he transferred his soul into a vessel of life, allowing him to become a lich. A lich is an immortal creature whose soul is trapped in a vessel of life and will not perish until that vessel is destroyed. Thus, the evil sorcerer who once conquered the world became a lich and began to make plans for his resurrection. And since resurrection required a significant amount of life force, he settled in a nearby remote estate and scattered enchanted spheres, collecting victims one after another. The spheres served as the mana cores necessary for resurrection, and with his great power, he planned to conquer the world once again. This goal was steadily approaching success. But why was there a barbarian here? But he was told that this was a rather remote area. He chose this place precisely because of its seclusion. It was far from prying eyes. Therefore, the presence of a barbarian here seemed extremely unnatural. The Lich saw that the creatures from the north had come quite far, and judging by his size, he would make an excellent victim, and he cast a special effect on the sphere. It hypnotizes only those who have not grasped mysticism. Therefore, anyone who ended up here because of the sphere does not know about mysticism. And so, this barbarian is an ordinary person who knows nothing about it. The fact that he does not appear to be hypnotized must be an illusion. Lich asked the barbarian to come closer again, and he became the cornerstone of his great resurrection. Catal, under hypnosis, arrived at that very place. Opening the door, he saw Lich standing before him. He believed that this was the real Lich. This is the highest form that a twisted sorcerer can achieve, a creature that always appears as a villain in fantasy. He never thought he would see the real Lich. The Lich asked the barbarian who he was, and don't say that the sphere didn't hypnotize him. Catal replied that now he understood how the Lich lured people here. The Lich didn't understand what that meant. He didn't sense a shred of mysticism from him. And now, he really was just a barbarian. Lich thought that he had an artifact of mind protection. It was a high-level artifact, so much so that even he couldn't sense it. And he didn't understand how the barbarian could have gotten hold of something like that. It seemed that he had just been lucky enough to find it somewhere. The barbarian replied that he had nothing of the sort. But Lich decided that the barbarian wanted to deceive him, and if he obediently fell under his spell, he could die without pain. But now, he would have to crush him with force. The Lich used magic and gave his servants permission to attack. The skeletons immediately rushed to attack the barbarian. But Catal understood that the dungeon where the evil Lich was hiding, and he thought he understood what was happening here. But the skeletons continued to attack, and he jumped into the air and used his sword. But Catal easily used his powers and made the skeleton's head turn to dust. He began to think that the skeleton was much more superficial than he had thought. But the Lich decided to see if the barbarian could still talk after he cut off his limbs. Using even more power, he recreated other skeletons, and finally said that as long as the barbarian was alive, that was all that mattered. He ordered the skeletons to attack him. The skeletons obeyed the order and rushed at him all at once with their swords. Catal was not afraid and, clenching his fist, struck one of them on the head. He used a little force with the others, destroying each of them. Lich watched all this in shock, unable to believe that he was so easily defeating his minions. As he expected, Kassan said that when they lose their heads, they die. Being a Lich, he thought that the enemy would at least command Death Knights, or someone even stronger. But here there were only ordinary skeletons. Lich got angry and said that he had entertained him long enough. He used his weapon and ordered the skeleton to rise. The barbarian immediately realized that this was a skeleton knight. He did not expect to see a skeleton knight here again, but then he thought about it. And since the knight was created by Lich, perhaps his powers were slightly different. In any case, it was getting interesting. Lich ordered the skeleton knight to kill the barbarian. Catal was not afraid and waited for the knight to come closer. But Catal used his speed and decided to see how strong he was. He picked up tremendous speed and slammed the skeleton right into the ground. But the skeleton proved to be strong, and only his defense was destroyed. Catal realized that he was indeed stronger, and he acknowledged this. Lich asked him to release his mana to the fullest. The skeleton knight obeyed the order and used his mana to the fullest. Catal was a little surprised by such mana, but it didn't scare him, and he thought, what should he do now? The skeleton knight's attack was so powerful that it seemed to tear the earth apart. Catal realized that the skeleton knight couldn't have done that. He immediately seized the moment and punched him in the head with his fist. The skeleton knight couldn't do anything and flew like a rag doll into the wall. After that, Catal approached and said that it was unusual but not like something completely different. But he asked, was that all? Lich asked him who he was. Shar replied that he did not sense any mysticism or magic from this barbarian, and if he had used an artifact, he would have at least sensed mana. But there was none. Was it really his own power? He defeated the skeleton knight with pure physical strength. Was that even possible? The Lich told him that he was special, and he decided to deal with the barbarian himself, and he could consider it an honor. Catal saw that black magic was slowly surrounding him, and he was surprised by this. The Lich asked him if he was afraid, and he should be afraid of this. Coming closer to him, he said that he would pay for invading his sanctuary. Catal replied that this was not the case. He had come only because the sphere had called him. And wasn't it he who had scattered these spheres? The Lich understood that this was true. In fact, everyone who had come here had been attracted by the spheres he had scattered, and it was the same with the barbarian. Lich ordered the barbarian to shut his mouth. Before him stood a great and mighty mage, the one who destroyed 5 kingdoms and fought heroes, and he called himself Karos Branulus Kessis. Catal was surprised and thought that names longer than 2 lines were in fashion here. The Lich ordered him to become the basis of his resurrection. With the help of his weapon, he created a vortex and directed it at the barbarian. It slowly spun before his eyes and continued to mesmerize him. It turned out to be magic that controlled human emotions. It evoked negativity, trapping the victim in it until their mind was completely broken. It was a unique magic created by Karos. It was incredibly powerful with minimal mana consumption. The sphere said that he was just a barbarian who did not possess any secret powers. He was completely powerless against real magic. What should he do now? There was something special about this barbarian, and it seemed that he did not have any special artifacts either. The Lich said he would take him with him and study him, and he ordered the sphere to drag him away. With a flick of his fingers, he ordered the skeleton to move. It began to obey Lich's commands completely, but suddenly Catal used his powers and struck the skeleton squarely in the head with a single blow. The blow was so powerful that the skeleton immediately lost its head and turned to dust. Lich was surprised again and didn't know how the barbarian did it. He didn't know how it happened, and it didn't work. Catal suddenly decided to ask him why he was just standing there watching. Why catch him with skeletons that he could snap like sunflower seeds? And then he became upset because it had become boring. He understood that humans are creatures driven by their emotions, and even if they are incredibly strong, there is always negativity deep down in their souls. And that is why it is impossible to avoid magic that is controlled by emotions. However, as he sees it, Lich cannot use magic such as fireballs or magic arrows. Lich replied that he didn't know how he was still standing, but how dare he compare his mania to such low-level spells. Suddenly, Lich ordered the aura to gather the entire flow, not matter with form, but a wave, and let it engulf the world and sow confusion among the unworthy. Catal also felt his eyes begin to sparkle, but Lich continued to speak and asked him to devour the barbarian. Catal was not afraid and continued to stand his ground. At that moment, Lich believed that victory was his, but suddenly his magic ended and he fell to his knees. But the sphere made him understand that he had overreached. He had used up everything except the mana necessary to stay on his feet. And yet, this guy was no longer a threat. Catal said that was somewhat impressive. He decided to find out once more. Was that all? The sphere was shocked with Lich, because even that didn't work. He had used the most powerful dark magic of all mind control spells, And even if a great hero had come, a direct hit should have completely destroyed his mind. And who was he anyway? Catal explained that it was impressive, but he didn't feel anything. And if that was Lich's best shot, he thinks it's his turn now. Lich realized that the barbarian had come here because he knew who was in front of him. And it turned out to be true. Catal suddenly asked him what he was talking about. Lich thought that the barbarian was so afraid of him that he admitted he was smart. And he managed to track him down so quickly. But he would still rise up, and he would promise to destroy his world again. In fact, Lich suddenly remembered that he had once heard that there was something in the Empire called a human production group, and a place where talented individuals were cultivated. And this barbarian must be from that very group, and a weapon created specifically to kill him. An assassin sent by the Empire. Lich began to shout that he, Karos Brenulus Kessis, would kill him and destroy the Empire anyway. Catal already thought this Lich was crazy. Lich used his powers and, taking his magic from the lamp, struck the barbarian with a beam of energy and asked him to give back the vessel. The Lich decided that he had entered the barbarian's body and taken control of his mind. Once that happened, if he couldn't be reborn as a Lich again, he would live forever in the barbarian's body. And now he had no other choice. Lich entered the barbarian's body and began to rejoice that this body belonged to him. Inside Catal's mind, the shell began to wonder. Was this really the barbarian's subconscious? It was the first time it had seen anything like this, and something was wrong here. Just looking at this place, he was already losing his mind. Was this the work of the Empire? Licha was not happy with this at all and screamed in pain. The sphere replied that this was not the case, and it was not the Empire. Even the Empire couldn't create something like this. The sphere began to feel his mind breaking. These were actually Lich Karos's last words. Catal still didn't understand what had happened. He suddenly jerked and immediately collapsed. And that black wave was pretty cool. But what was it called? Catal tried to remember. He thought about Lich and thought that this was not the final form of a mage's evolution. He wanted so much to know what kind of magic he used. And it seemed that leaks in this world weren't that impressive. But in any case, he had cleared the dungeon so he could collect his reward. Catal saw a stick on the floor and remembered that it glowed when he cast spells. Was it a magical artifact? And if he used it, would he be able to use magic too? He took the stone out of the stick. He decided it would be best to keep it for himself. And since this item belonged to Lich, could this jug be a vessel of life? He picked up the vessel from the floor and decided to show it to Rosa so she could evaluate it. Having gathered everything around him, he had looted enough. But before leaving, he saw that there was some kind of seal in front of him. He thought it must be a secret room. Catal touched the seal with his finger, and it began to dissolve. Immediately, everything around him began to open up, and he saw a bunch of people who were unconscious. He was delighted to see the secret room. After all, he didn't believe it existed, but he didn't know who these people were. Catal approached and began waving in front of their eyes, but they paid no attention. He started shouting and asking if he was alive. Now he didn't know what to do. He decided to leave first. As soon as he reported the situation here, they would surely send people to deal with it. He went straight to Rosa. The girl was surprised that the gentleman had returned earlier than usual today. Catal explained that there were some matters that needed to be settled. Rosa was surprised to hear about the matters. Catal replied that he was talking about the sphere he had shown her yesterday. Rosa listened and asked him not to joke like that. Catal replied that he was serious. Rosa knew that Lich, one of only 5 in the whole world, could be in such a place. Catal immediately took out the vessel and placed it on the table. He said that he had brought the urn, which apparently was the vessel of Lich's life. He asked her to evaluate it. Rosa was shocked and saw that the barbarian was not lying. She asked what was going on. Catal explained that there were people inside. He wanted to pull them out, but their minds were already empty, so he left them there. The guild should send someone to investigate. Rosa became curious. Could this be the reason? And now that she thought about it, people had been disappearing in this area lately, but none of them had ever been found. If it was all the work of the Lich, she decided to call someone who understood more. Rose went straight to the guard, and he was shocked by what he heard. After all, he had heard about Lich. Catal sat on the bench, frozen, and said he was pleased to meet her. But he explained that everything had been taken care of, so there was no need to worry. It wasn't that important. The guard decided to ask him what he meant. Catal remembered and gave the guard his name. And he realized that the guard knew him? The guard replied that he did. After all, he was the mage who had turned the world upside down more than a century ago. The creator of magic that controlled emotions and caused endless chaos. He also drove kings mad and destroyed 5 kingdoms. And now this creature is here, like Lich. The guard asked if this was really true. Catal replied that it was, but he wasn't that impressive. He just did strange things and ended up destroying himself. The guard was shocked, not to mention what he was saying. And it was even strange that a mage of Karos's level had destroyed himself. And now he wants a detailed explanation. Catal said that even if he asked, he had nothing more to say. The guard asked the barbarian to wait there for a minute. He would go and report to his master. The lord received the information and was shocked. He couldn't believe that the Lich was right on their territory, but he asked if they were sure it was really a Lich. Maybe it was just another type of monster. The guard replied that, according to the testimony of those who had been rescued, it seemed that the monster was indeed a Lich. They also had physical evidence. The lord was shocked to hear about a Lich of such power hiding near the city. The Empire could send investigators at any moment, and Lord Cain was not there. This was indeed a serious problem. The lord became angry and stood up, telling him to prepare to send a message to the capital. They were lucky this time. But the guard replied that if that barbarian hadn't found him, they could have been the first victims. And most likely Karos was in the process of returning in the form of a fox. So apparently, his condition at that moment was unstable. The lord replied that this was logical, but even so, it was a truly remarkable achievement. They must reward him appropriately. And starting today, they would hope to be able to offer a reward commensurate with his efforts. The next morning, this girl came to the lord and shouted at the top of her voice. The lord replied that he was already awake, and asked to be let in. The girl told the lord that Lord Aquaz, the inquisitor of the sun god, had arrived in the territory. The lord met with her and asked what was going on and why the sun had come here. They sat down at the table, and the lord introduced himself and said that it was a great honor for him. He was grateful for her visit. The inquisitor of the sun god, Aquaz, introduced herself and said that she was the judge who punished those who strayed in his name. Aquaz was the youngest person ever to receive this title. She was the one who executed 7 heretics who had made deals with demons and single-handedly disrupted their great ritual. And now she is the strongest inquisitor of the sun god on the entire continent. Even the empire bows to the teachings of the Church of the Sun. Her power far exceeds that of an ordinary territorial lord like him, and he doesn't know why someone like her. Aquaz said that there was a disturbance in their territory. The lord replied that there had been a small problem with the nearby dungeon, but the issue had already been resolved. And now the lord realized that the purpose of the visit was not to hunt the Lich, so he decided to ask her what the purpose of her visit was. Aquaz replied that she had come to talk to him about a divine revelation. However, before telling him, could he learn more about what had recently happened in their territory? Lord replied that it was barbarian, and she meant that he was the one who defeated Lich? Most likely, Lich Karos Branulus Kessis. Aquaz asked if this creature had been here and requested proof. The lord immediately placed Karos's phylactery on the table. Aquaz did not understand what had happened here, and she became curious. Was the barbarian still in this territory? The lord replied that he was still on his territory. Aquaz did not believe that the barbarian had managed to defeat Karos, but the lord made it clear to her that anything was possible now. Even the swordsman Cain had once been defeated by him. Aquaz replied that a new force had appeared, but what tribe did this barbarian belong to? The lord replied that the barbarian claimed to be from the snowy wasteland. Aquaz was shocked to hear about the snowy wasteland. She asked him again, did he mean to say that this barbarian had left the snowy wasteland? How could anyone escape alive from the land of monsters? And could it be that this barbarian was the reason she had been sent here? The lord was shocked and stared at her with wide eyes. Aquaz decided to ask if she could meet this barbarian in person. Meanwhile, Catal lay in his room and wondered how exactly this device worked. It seemed to be some kind of artifact that amplified magic. He would simply ask the mage about it later. Suddenly, he raised his head and saw that it was already light outside and it was time. But a guard came to him and said that the inquisitor of the sun god wanted to meet him in the church, and when he met her, he had to show her the proper respect. Catal told him not to worry about it. The barbarian immediately got dressed and prepared to leave. The guard thought that in that case, it was time to go. In fact, gods really do exist in this world. They bestow their powers directly and can even descend to earth themselves, to the place where their followers gather. And that place is called a church. But he does not understand the difference between churches in fantasy and in the real world. Upon arriving at the location, the guard said that this was the church. Catal looked up and was amazed by the beauty of the church of the sun god. The guard decided to take his leave at the entrance and informed him that someone would show him in when he entered. Upon entering, he was surprised. He was immediately greeted by nuns who welcomed him. A nun informed him that the inquisitor Aquaz was waiting for him. She would now escort him to her office. When she met him, Aquaz greeted him and showed that she was pleased to meet him. Catal responded with the same courtesy. He was surprised that the inquisitor was so young. She must be truly gifted. Aquaz was shocked that the barbarian was smiling. It seemed to her that he was plotting something. Catal immediately got down to business and asked why she had summoned him. Aquaz replied that it concerned his recent incident in the dungeon. Karos, whom, as he claims, the barbarian defeated. He had previously committed many evil deeds around the world. In the end, he became a lich, and only heroes were capable of opposing him. Catal replied that he had heard about it, but the Karos he fought was a lich who couldn't sit still and ended up destroying himself. And it seems she doesn't believe his words. He's just telling what he saw. Aquaz decided to ask him if he would accept her god as a direct witness to their conversation. The barbarian didn't understand what kind of witness she meant. Aquaz explained that if he lied to her, there would be divine intervention. Catal realized that it was like a lie detector, only a sacred version. Aquaz saw that the barbarian was different from other barbarians, but in the end, he was still a barbarian. He would never agree to her request. But she informed him that if he had any objections, he could refuse. But Catal decided to find out why he should refuse. He realized that this was a golden opportunity to experience divine power for himself. Aquaz asked him if he was sure. The barbarian was ready to start right away. Aquaz was surprised and thought he seemed very enthusiastic. She asked him if he was embarrassed, but barbarian did not understand what she meant. Aquaz replied that God was watching their conversation, but the barbarian did not understand why he should be concerned. Until now, he had spoken nothing but the truth, and he had never lied to anyone. Aquaz did not refuse him and decided to begin. Aquaz began to recite her spell and asked the god to expose all lies with his gaze. The light of God was so bright that the barbarian did not understand what it was, and he began to feel a higher presence, a being so great that it could not be described in human words, and he looked at him with a feeling of confusion. Aquaz saw that, fortunately, no divine intervention followed, and Aquaz suggested that he start a conversation, and from now on, no one can lie in this place. Katala was not frightened by this and immediately agreed. It was a conversation under the supervision of the Lord of the Sun. He answered questions about clearing the dungeon just as he had before, and there was no divine intervention. In other words, everything he said was true. Perhaps Karos, who was preparing for resurrection, was weakened. If Karos could use magic, this barbarian would not be here, and he was really lucky. The barbarian asked her if her doubts had been dispelled. Aquar apologized for her bluntness, but the barbarian didn't care. He even liked it. But finally, she asked if she could ask one personal question. The barbarian replied that he didn't mind. She asked him if he was really a barbarian from the snowy wasteland. Catal replied that it was true. But Aquara continued to ask if he had really come from those lands. She learned that he was from the demonic realm. And was he really the Ash barbarian from the Imperial legends? But suddenly the barbarian decided to ask her a question too. He wanted to know why she was here. Aquara replied that she had personal business here. But the barbarian suggested that this business had to do with the suspicion that he was a heretic. The girl replied that she did not understand what he was talking about. The barbarian did not understand much about it, but it seemed that it was not often that the Lord looked down on such things, and too much attention to simply prevent lies. In fact, Aquara wanted to say no, but under the Lord's gaze, no lies were allowed. And she replied that everything was correct. And the barbarian realized that he had been the target from the very beginning. The girl made it clear to him that this was not the case. It was a divine prophecy. When she arrived in these lands, She thought that the barbarian might be the one in the prophecy, but he can see the result for himself, and she apologized for hiding her intentions. But the barbarian didn't care. He found it interesting in its own way. Then he wanted to ask her one more question. He asked her what the prophecy was about. Aquar understood that she should not reveal the content of the prophecy to anyone except trusted individuals, but she slowly and clearly told him about the prophecy. Ketal, meanwhile, was a little surprised. After the conversation, the Lord came to her and saw that she looked worried. Aquar replied that she had met him. However, this only complicated matters. The Lord became curious about what kind of person the barbarian was. The girl explained that he was indeed a barbarian from the snowy wastelands. Lord didn't really believe it at first, but Aquar understood that although she had failed to obtain information about the snowy wastelands themselves, at least his identity had been confirmed. She hoped it was a lie, but in the end, it was an undeniable truth. But the Lord understood that if this became known, the world would be in turmoil. And there were many who wanted to explore the snowy wastelands, especially the Emperor. And if the Emperor intervened directly, who knows what chaos would ensue. Aquara informed him that he need not worry about it. They would deal with Karos themselves, and they planned to hide the barbarian's existence from the public. The Lord decided that this was for the best. But were all the barbarians from the snowy wasteland like him? The girl replied that most likely not. If all barbarians were like that, they would have already left the snowy wasteland and conquered the world. The Lord understood that this was true. Even without him, there were many barbarians in the world. Their military strength was considerable, but they were unimaginably stupid. It was an innate limitation of barbarians. But if those who are the highest race in terms of strength also possessed intelligence, and they say that the current king of the barbarians is different from his predecessors. He has heard that he possesses both strength and intelligence. Aquar thought that the Lord spoke as if he had seen all the barbarians. She had only met him once, but he was definitely different from the usual barbarians. The Lord understood that it would be interesting if they met, but Aquar could not say the same. However, relations between barbarians and servants of the gods were far from friendly, so their growing power was more of a cause for concern. But the Lord became curious about the content of the prophecy that required them to meet with him in person. Aquar believed that confirmation was needed. The Lord asked what other confirmation was needed. The girl replied that it was whether he was a real person or something that only had a human appearance. The Lord decided to find out what the prophecy contained. The girl answered him truthfully. The Lord listened and did not understand how such a thing could have happened. After that, he met with the barbarian and decided to ask him how he was doing. The barbarian replied that thanks to the Lord, everything was fine. But why had he called him again? The Lord understood that as a ruler, he had something to tell him. First of all, he expressed his gratitude. He had saved these lands from Lich, and if no one had stopped him, their small lands would have been destroyed in an instant. And then, unexpectedly, the Lord apologized. The barbarian was shocked and did not understand why. The Lord replied that he believed that the act by which he had defeated Karos could not be made public, and the victory over Karos was an outstanding achievement, but it should not be made known to the Emperor. If the Emperor found out about it, he would intervene personally. It was better to give up the honors that this man deserved. Ketal said outright that he didn't care. But the Lord felt that this was not enough to be called an apology, but he had prepared a reward for saving these lands, and now he is presenting him with the reward given by the Lord. Ketal was surprised to see that he had placed a leather bag on the table, but Lord explained that this was no ordinary leather bag. He asked him to take a closer look, and he would understand everything. He said that inside was an artifact in the form of a bag. It could hold as many items as the space inside the bag allowed, and the space inside was about the same size as this living room. The barbarian understood that the artifact was an object created with magic. It was the first time he had seen one in real life. But the Lord explained to him that even if it seemed that an item would not fit in the bag, he could put as much as he wanted in it. And looking at his axe, Barbarian decided to check this bag. From the outside, it seemed that it would not fit, but when he put it against the bag, it sucked the weapon in. The Lord explained that to get something out, he just needed to put his hand in the bag and think about the item. Barbarian tried it, and it worked. The Lord said that this was his gift in gratitude for protecting their lands. He hoped that Barbarian would like it. Catal was delighted and thrilled, and he would definitely find a good use for it. The Lord At was glad to see that he liked the gift so much, and he thinks that they can end their business here. Now, all that remains is the prophecy. He does not understand what is happening in this wilderness. Earlier, the Swordmaster said that distortions from the demon world were coming into this world, and it seems that something is happening in this world. The Lord believed that this could be related to the prophecy. Aquaz saw that the prophecy said that a great evil would come. It would descend here and spread throughout the world. In fact, the territory of Varkan is essentially a network of villages that are closely linked economically. And because of this, the villages interact on a daily basis. One day, communication with one of the villages was suddenly cut off. At first, no one paid any attention to it, but when days passed without any news, the neighboring village sent people to check. But they never returned. Upon hearing this, the Lord sent guards. They did not return either. Only then did the Lord realize that something terrible was happening. Barbarian arrived at Rosa's and decided to find out what their orders were for today. Rosa replied that they had an urgent request from the Lord today. The Barbarian asked what it was about. The girl replied that they needed to check on the village from which the message had disappeared. A few days ago, one of the villages had stopped responding. He simply needed to go there and investigate the situation. It was a simple request for reconnaissance, but the pay was very generous. Barbarian liked it and decided to take it. When he left the territory, his team was already waiting for him. He saw Hayes and turned to her. Hayes was surprised by his clothes. Catal replied that he had just picked up his new outfit from the tailor. The clothes he wore in his homeland were completely worn out. Hayes said that this was quite unusual, but Barbarian replied that he had chosen them himself. She found this quite impressive. Hayes asked the gentleman if he had also accepted this order. Catal replied that this was correct. He could not refuse such interesting work. Hasey thought he was really unusual. Catal became curious as to why she was alone. The other participants had not come. Would Alessandro and Kassan not be going with them? The priestess replied that they were supposed to get some information, so they probably declined. Catal looked around and saw that there were fewer people than he had expected, but he understood that the task was simple and the reward was great. He thought it would attract a lot of people, but there weren't even 10 of them. The priestess thought it was a rather dangerous task, but Catal thought the task itself was simple. Hasey replied that it was simple, but the pay was too high. Rumor had it that the guards who went to check on the village had not returned, and it seemed that the task was not so simple, but Catal saw that too few people had come. He had expected at least 10 people. The priestess said that there was actually another rumor. The barbarian asked what that rumor was. She started laughing and saw that Aquaz had approached them. She was the inquisitor of the temple of the sun god. She accepted the task. Few mercenaries wanted to work side by side with the inquisitor of the sun god, and she's not going to crack her skull open, because she's very scary. Catal replied that this would not happen. She is a polite and kind woman. The priestess was surprised that he knew Lady Aquaz. Catal replied that it was true and let her know that she was his friend. The priestess couldn't believe that the inquisitor heretic and the barbarian were friends. Catal approached her and said he was glad to see her again. Aquaz replied that she did not remember when they had become friends. Kethel smiled and said that if she couldn't remember, he suggested they become friends right now. What did she think about that? Aquaz changed the subject and told him that his companion served a different god. She was referring to Lady Halrosia. Catal realized that she knew her. Aquaz confirmed this and asked if she was really a priestess serving Lady Halrosia. The barbarian asked if that was a problem. Aquaz replied that it wasn't, but as far as she knew, Lady Halrosia's followers were currently in a period of peace. Only those who hold fairly high positions can act at such a time. The priestess overheard this conversation and shouted that this was not the case. Aquaz understood that she could not know all the details about every order of other faiths, so she must be mistaken. But then the guards approached them, and they saw that Catal had also begun his task. Catal said that they were meeting here again. The captain immediately greeted everyone who had accepted this order, and if everyone was gathered, it was time to get started. Catal was surprised that they had all gathered like this, and it seemed to him that the raid was about to begin. He said loudly that since Aquaz had decided to intervene, the time had come. The girl replied that she couldn't say. The gods had not revealed to them the exact signs of the prophecy's fulfillment. It might turn out to be nothing worth paying attention to. And maybe there was some simple reason why the people in this village weren't making contact. But Barber understood that she meant that something worse was not out of the question. Aquaz replied that they had said that evil would descend. The descent of a great evil. Katalu liked this very much. The guards brought them to the place and said they had arrived. And this was the entrance to the village. The captain asked Milady what she thought. Aquaz replied that she could not sense a single living soul. The captain said that this most likely meant that they had simply fled. He ordered them to spread out and look for any traces. This frightened the boys a little, but Ketil was even more pleased and agreed. Judging by the size of the village, at least 100 people lived there. And it was impossible for so many people to simply disappear without a trace. But the captain believed that there must be some kind of clue. He ordered the search to begin. Suddenly, one of the participants saw food on the table and immediately called the captain. The captain didn't understand what was so important about that. They had fled, so they had left their food behind. But the participant replied that that wasn't what he meant. He explained that the food had just been prepared and was still warm. The captain was shocked and didn't know how this could be. He asked loudly what was going on. The residents had not been in contact for at least several days. Since then, detachments had been sent there, but none had returned. He decided to find out if there was any other evidence. The mercenary replied that there was none yet. There were no signs of escape or of anyone hiding. The captain thought for a moment and ordered the search to continue. He realized that there were all the signs that life was going on as usual, but there was not a single living soul to be found. Suddenly, one of the mercenaries stopped. The captain immediately asked him what was going on. The mercenary replied that everything was the same. There was evidence that they had been there just a few minutes ago, but now there was no one there. The captain decided to ask the lady if she had any ideas. Aquaz replied that she didn't know either. The captain then asked Barbarian if he had found out anything. Katal replied that he had not found any traces either. There was not even a trace of their presence. He suggested asking someone who really knew something. The captain was surprised and didn't know what he was talking about. But Katal asked him if he hadn't noticed. Someone was here. The captain asked him what he meant. He understood that there was someone else, a presence that had not been there when they first arrived in the village. If you think about it, it's that woman. And who is she? And when had she joined the group? The girl suddenly asked them. Wasn't it interesting? She thought she was hiding perfectly. How did he notice her? Ketil replied that when someone appears suddenly, like a jack-in-the-box, it's hard not to notice. The girl said no, that's not what she meant. Usually people can't see her at all, and even the inquisitor of the sun god didn't sense it, did she? And he didn't seem like someone who knew mysticism. She became curious about who he was. She had caught an unexpected catch today. Upon hearing these words, the captain immediately ordered everyone to retreat immediately. But he saw that Lady Aquaz was standing still and not moving. She said she couldn't feel anything. The priestess realized that even the Inquisition of the highest religious order could not sense her presence. And that meant one of two things. Either she was not evil and not a demon, or she was such a powerful demon that it was impossible to recognize her. The girl said that of course it was a pity. She wanted so much to follow them and see their lands. Her face suddenly began to change and her skin peeled off. She said she had made up her mind, and now she would take the funny little barbarian into slavery and drag him to hell. The demon waved her fingers, and a hellish eye appeared above her, pulling everything inside. She flew up into the sky and showed off her beauty. Everyone was shocked and had never seen anything like it before. The captain, seeing this, immediately ordered them to run away and not look back. But the demon used her powers and created a huge barrier that they couldn't escape from. The mercenaries screamed and begged to be let out. The demon showed them that this was her village, and no one could escape from here, because they were all prey. The priestess said that she couldn't be a demon, and asked where she came from. Katal didn't understand who she was and had never heard of demons before. The priestess replied that it was true, she was a demon with a name, and she began to ask Lady Kalotzia to save her. Katal turned to her and told her to calm down. After all, he was with her. He became curious about what made a named demon different. The priestess replied that not all demons in this world were so powerful. They are called demons only because it is more convenient. In reality, most of them are just fragments of evil and magic. However, there are those who can truly be called demons. They are not born of a mother, but of the cradle of darkness. They are creatures that give themselves names. True demons, even the weakest of the named demons, are capable of destroying an entire kingdom. Catal believed that this demon was one of them. The priestess replied that he was correct, and judging by those horns, it was Ashetar, a demon that had revealed itself hundreds of years ago. And what was such a creature doing in such a remote place? Catal decided to find out if they could destroy it. The priestess replied that they could not. This place had already become the demon's domain. Until they defeated the demon, the barrier could not be removed. Catal was disappointed and decided to look around a little longer. The priestess didn't understand what he was doing there. Catal smiled and replied that he was doing nothing. It was all the demons doing. Ashetar asked them if it wasn't fun. Weren't they interested in playing detectives? Aquaz wondered why there were traces of recent activity in the deserted village, as if the people had just disappeared. It was all just a trick by the demon. Most likely it was just to laugh at those who would come here in search of survivors. Aquaz replied that it was a cruel game. Catal, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines and even found some food for himself. To summon such a named demon, a huge sacrifice is needed. The inhabitants of an entire village would not be enough for that. And for the territory to change like this, it's simply impossible to do it unnoticed. She became curious about how he got into this world. Ashetar began to laugh and saw that the girl really thought she would answer her. Aquar became angry and began to call her a filthy evil that defiled this land. The demon began to laugh and did not understand who was dirty here. Unclean? And she turned to the servant of the gods. And does she really think her god will save her? Now she needs to listen carefully. This world is full of cracks. It no longer belongs only to them, mortals. Long ago, gods and humans fought against evil, and in the end, the gods and humans won. The defeated evil was banished from this world. The demon informed them that she had been waiting for this day in the cursed abyss. And she is the demon of gravity. She will wash away the shame of the past and cover this world in darkness. Aquar called her a vile spawn and showed her that this world belongs to the gods and humans. And so she will now return to where the demon came from. She commanded the light to descend, and the light began to cover her entirely with rays of light. Aquar took her light staff and transformed into a strong and powerful warrior. Catal watched all this and still thought that she would not attack during the transformation. Aquar stood opposite her, lowering her light staff, but the demon said she was even curious. She took out her demonic staff and was ready to fight the servant of the gods, but Aquaz informed her that she was lying, and immediately proceeded with her light attack. In the center of the village, they clashed with their weapons, and on one side, bright light penetrated through, while on the other, a dark surface reflected only a faint light. But Aquaz was not ready to give up so easily, and with a little more effort, a huge explosion occurred. All the mercenaries covered their ears from the explosion. The demoness and Aquaz moved away to a distance to resume their attacks. The demon said that the battle should be worthy. Didn't they know that as seekers of the gods? But Aquaz decided to find out if that was all she had to say. She immediately launched a light attack with her staff. The demon stood still and did not move, and suddenly, at the last moment, she vanished before her eyes. Aquaz was surprised and did not understand how this could be. But the demon was already behind her and replied that this was what she could do. But Aquaz, hearing her voice, immediately used her shield to repel the demon's attack. But she was strong, and the shield began to crumble. The demon said she would destroy her, and with an explosive blow, she launched her attack. Aquaz withstood it, but the demon's power was so great that her feet slipped on the ground. She launched powerful attacks to break her shield, but at the last moment, she used her sharp finger and broke the shield into tiny pieces. But Aquaz applied the scripture in the second chapter in the style of the 12 poems, and the light of glory will never be eclipsed by anyone. Aquaz took on even more enormous power and became several times more powerful. The demoness was surprised that she was able to read scripture at such a young age. She was very impressed. But Aquaz continued to use the 5th chapter, in verse 59 of the page. Raising her staff, she used divine light to incinerate all the filth. Aquar took this bright light, and with a strong swing, raised her staff and released the divine light. The blow was so strong that the demoness did not expect it, but managed to deflect it. She tried to get her by any means necessary, but Aquar dodged her. They looked at each other with fierce glances, but neither of them slowed down. They were ready to fight to their last breath. Meeting in the middle, they clashed with their weapons, and anger simply sparkled. The dark and light sides were so strong and powerful that an explosion occurred. The mercenaries watched the battle and called for help from the explosion, but the demoness and Aquars continued to fight. Meanwhile, Ketal watched this magnificent battle and rejoiced. But suddenly the priestess asked Ketal if he would help Aquar. The barbarian replied that he could do so, but he remained silent, wondering why he should do so. The priestess was surprised by his thinking and did not know how to respond. Ketal asked again why he should interfere and spoil such a spectacle, and to be honest, he himself would not refuse to fight the demon. But now he preferred to be a spectator. The priestess really did not expect this from him. But Demonica and Aquar clashed like small pieces of glass. Stepping back, Demonica realized that this hound of the gods was strong, but in terms of brute force, she was still unmatched. Aquar took advantage of this moment and struck with her light staff, but Demonica also noticed that their powers were unequal. Aquar was persistent and held her shield in her hands on the other side. In this world, creatures of darkness are no match for the bearers of divine power. If this continued, the battle would drag on. In that case, the demoness decided to seize the initiative. She used demonic magic to move her attack. Aquar noticed this and was a little surprised. She realized that she was right, that this was dangerous. Demonica used almost all her power for a single attack in the direction of the good light, but Aquar managed to dodge and defend herself. She held her shield very tightly so that the darkness would not pass in her direction, but behind her lay the mercenaries, who were very frightened. Seeing them, she realized that she had to stand her ground no matter what. After repelling the attack, Aquar called her a filthy creature. But the demoness began to laugh and saw that they were indeed expecting an honest fight from the demon. But Aquar did not like this, and for the sake of victory, she applied the writing of chapter 1 and verse 1. With a single movement, her power affected the portal and created its own, telling the other mercenaries to go inside. The mercenaries were very happy and thanked Lady Aquaz for her help. The demoness began to laugh loudly and decided to find out if it was really possible to waste such a precious scripture. Aquaz did not like this and flew at her, shouting for her to shut up. The demon smiled and made it clear to her that this was exactly how she should behave. But Aquaz was not ready to leave just like that. She waved her light staff right in front of her head. But the demon was a nimble creature, and flying up a little, she dodged the attack. Then she said loudly in response to the light side that death was nothing more than death itself, and no one would ever recognize her so-called noble sacrifice. And with this turn of events, she would lose and disgrace her god. But if she defeated her and returned, not only her prestige, but also the influence of her god would increase, because that is what Aquaz herself thinks. And for that, she just needs to destroy the shrine that protects them. And what does she have to say about that? Aquaz became angry and made it clear to her that she was even trying to resort to cheap tricks. But Demon asked, she wasn't planning on dying here, was she? Aquaz replied that it was no longer worth listening to. Then the demoness ordered her to die a martyr's death, and she directed a demonic stream right at her. Aquaz managed to react and put up her shield so that it wouldn't hit her. She flew high into the air and changed her demonic form, and Aquaz could only see a dark force. But she didn't stop there and flew straight towards her with her quick steps. Aquaz was shocked by this and did not understand how it happened. But the demoness used an explosive attack, and the light side retreated. But the demon did not stop after that and continued to pursue her. She created a demonic ring in front of her and set her target inside it. Aquaz was surprised and said that the shining shrine repelled the darkness. But the demoness flew above her and shouted that she didn't care. She no longer wanted to listen to her god's poems. Seizing the perfect moment, she entered her dome and grabbed her by the throat. Aquaz couldn't scream because Demonica covered her mouth with her hand. But she managed to escape from this terrible tremor. And stepping back, Demonica swung her attack, but she managed to use her shield. The demon's power was very high, but Aquaz tried to stay on her feet. But she had had enough of all this, and she decided to act differently. Deceiving Aquaz, she caught her with her demonic ropes. The mercenaries who were under protection suddenly saw their dome begin to collapse. The dark side slowly began to take over the light side. The mercenaries said that with this turn of events, they would all perish. But the demoness claimed that she would enjoy them all as dessert. But before that happened, she became curious about what the noble dog of God would taste like. But suddenly she felt a hand on her shoulder telling him to stop. The demoness did not understand and asked, "What?" She did not understand how he was able to approach her. She did not feel his presence at all. Catal did not stand on ceremony with her, and with a single blow threw her straight into the sky. The demoness couldn't handle him. Then Catal approached Aquaz and asked if she was all right. Aquaz immediately realized that he was the superhuman who had defeated the swordmaster Cain. But even so, the demoness came to her senses and called the barbarian insolent. She decided to ask him how he dared to interfere with her meal. Catal replied that Aquaz was her friend. Therefore, he couldn't just let her die. She planned to keep him alive as a toy, but Catal replied that he had no intention of becoming her toy. The demon smiled and asked him if he was sure of his words. She took out her weapon and claimed that she would have to die. Catal suddenly asked Aquaz to step aside, but the goddess said that he couldn't defeat the demon. But the barbarian said he was strong enough. Aquaz replied that it was not a matter of strength or weakness. Only the divine can banish the demon from this world. No other power is capable of doing so. In fact, this was a law established at the dawn of time when gods and demons first appeared. Aquaz understood that this was especially true since they were in the demon's territory. He could never count on miracles here. She decided to ask him, so only gods can resist demons. Catal replied that even if that were true, it seemed she was unable to fight. Aquaz said that she had to do it. And who serves God? And she is the one who opposes evil. Catal thought that this was the will of those who serve the divine, and he said that she impressed him. But he would continue to fight with her. The barbarian said that he himself wanted to fight the demon. The demon saw that he really did not understand, and she told him that he could not defeat her. The barbarian decided to ask her if she would let him try. The demoness replied that she wanted to see his eyes distort with pain. Suddenly, she used her teleportation powers and appeared right in front of him. Aquaz was very frightened at that moment and started screaming at him to get out of the way. But the demoness smiled at that moment and already understood that she had defeated him. But Catal was ready for this, and with one blow struck the demoness on the head, tearing it from her body. At that moment, the head was crushed into liquid, and Aquaz watched in shock.